Imagine a night 4,000 years ago when someone pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded something extraordinary. Not a king's victory, not a merchant's inventory, but a story about the moment when divine workers laid down their tools, lit fires in defiance, and surrounded their master's temple demanding freedom. The tablet exists. You can visit it in the British Museum. Catalog number 1889 0426 236. It tells the story of the Atrahasis epic, and in its opening lines, it describes something historians rarely discuss, a rebellion among the gods themselves. The text is matter of fact, clinical even. When the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. Then it describes what happened next. The lesser gods, called the Igigi, stopped working. They burned their tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief administrator of earth, in the middle of the night, and they refused to return to their labor. This isn't metaphor embroidered with later interpretation. This is what the clay says, translated directly from Akkadian cuneiform. A labor revolt, a strike, a moment when workers, divine or otherwise, said enough and demanded change. And according to this ancient text, the solution to that rebellion was the creation of humanity itself. We were fashioned from clay and divine blood specifically to replace the striking workforce. To do the work, the Igigi refused to continue. What if this isn't mythology? What if the Sumerians were recording something they understood to be history? An event so pivotal, it explained why human beings existed at all. Before you dismiss it, consider that you're about to explore tablets you can verify yourself, excavations with documented histories, and a pattern of rebellion that appears not once, but repeatedly across Mesopotamian literature. These weren't simple people telling campfire stories. They were the world's first civilization, inventors of writing, mathematics, law codes, and astronomical observation. They recorded what they believed mattered. So comment below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Because for the next few hours, we're going to explore the possibility that Sumerian cuneiform tablets preserve not myths, but memories. Memories of a rebellion so significant it changed the relationship between gods and mortals forever. Memories of the first time anyone in recorded history said no to the powers that ruled them. Let's begin with what the texts actually say. The hierarchy written in clay. To understand a rebellion, you must first understand the order that was being rebelled against. The Sumerian cosmos wasn't chaotic. It was meticulously organized, bureaucratic even, with clear hierarchies, assigned responsibilities, and documented chains of command. This wasn't later invention. It was how Sumerians conceptualized reality from their earliest writings onward. At the top sat An or Anu, god of heaven. He was the distant sovereign, the ultimate authority, but rarely involved in day-to-day operations. Below him, active management was divided among several key figures. Enlil controlled the air, the earth, and administered the populated world. Enki, also called E, governed the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the Abzu, and represented wisdom, magic, and technical knowledge. These were the great gods, the Anunnaki, whose decisions shaped cosmic policy. The term Anunnaki appears frequently in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets in the British Museum, there's a specific accounting. After the god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and establishes order, he divides the Anunnaki. 300 are assigned to heaven, 300 to the netherworld and earth. This is Tablet 6, lines 38-44, and it's not poetic, it's administrative. 600 gods allocated by decree, assigned to posts. But beneath the Anunnaki was another group, the Igigi. Their name appears in texts from the Old Babylonian period through Neo-Assyrian times, roughly 2000 to 600 BCE. In the earliest sources, particularly the Atrahasis epic composed around 1700 BC, the Igigi are explicitly described as the laboring class of the divine world. They are younger, lower in rank, and they do the physical work that keeps the cosmos functioning. This hierarchy wasn't unique to one text or one city. It appears across Mesopotamian literature with remarkable consistency. In Eridu, the southernmost city of Sumer, the same structure. In Nippur, the religious center, the same. In Babylon, during its later prominence, the same. The Anunnaki made decisions. The Igigi executed them. And for what the texts call 40 years, though the Sumerian numerical system makes exact chronology difficult, the Igigi performed the most grueling task imaginable. They dug the rivers. This sounds simple until you consider what it meant. Mesopotamia's agricultural wealth depended entirely on irrigation. The Tigris and Euphrates provided water, but that water needed channels, canals, embankments, and constant maintenance. We're talking about moving millions of cubic meters of earth with nothing but Bronze Age tools. Archaeological surveys of southern Iraq have documented ancient canal systems hundreds of kilometers long, some requiring excavation through clay and silt deposits meters deep. The Atrahasis epic describes this with unexpected detail. The great gods made the Igigi suffer the work. The gods had to dig watercourses. They had to clear channels. The life of the land required. This is from Tablet 1, Column I, lines 5-8. Then it specifies they dug the Tigris River and also dug the Euphrates. Not symbolic language, geographic specifics, named rivers, actual infrastructure. For 40 years, according to the text, the Igigi did this work. They excavated, they hauled, they maintained, and the text emphasizes their suffering. The work was heavy, the distress was much. There's no glory in this description, no noble purpose celebrated. Just labor, unending, under the authority of gods who did not share it. The Anunnaki, meanwhile, appear in very different contexts. They sit in council. They make decisions. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu kill the Bull of Heaven, it's the Anunnaki who gather to pass judgment. In the Descent of Inanna, when the goddess Inanna illegally enters the underworld and attempts to seize power from her sister Ereshkigal, it's the 7 judges, the Anunnaki, who pass the sentence of death upon her. They are magistrates, administrators, overseers, but they do not dig. This division of divine labor mirrors earthly social structures with unsettling precision. Sumerian cities had sharp class stratification. Temple records from Lagash, and Uruk document different categories of workers, free citizens, dependent laborers, and slaves. Ration lists show differential food allocation based on status. Legal codes like those of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar specify different penalties for offenses based on social class. The Sumerians lived within rigid hierarchy, and they projected that same hierarchy into heaven. Or perhaps they recorded what they believed they'd inherited from heaven. The texts never question whether this arrangement was just. They simply describe it as the way things were. The Anunnaki commanded. The Ajiji obeyed. This was cosmic order, as fundamental as the movement of stars or the cycle of seasons. The Sumerian term for this order was Mi, not morality, but something closer to the way things function, divine decrees that structured reality itself. But the Atrahasis epic suggests something that other texts only hint at. What if this order wasn't eternal? What if there was a moment when it broke down, when the workers refused to work and the system had to be restructured entirely? That's where things become interesting. Because if you read carefully, the text doesn't present the rebellion as chaos or evil. It presents it as response to unbearable conditions. The gods cried out, complaining about the drudgery. They took counsel together, and then they acted. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as mythology explaining why humans exist, were created to do work that gods found burdensome. It's ideological narrative, explaining present reality through divine prehistory. And that's certainly part of it. But notice what the text doesn't do. It doesn't condemn the Ajiji. It doesn't call them evil or rebellious in the way later religious traditions would label Lucifer or other fallen angels. It simply says they were suffering, and they stopped. Consider the implications. The world's oldest labor dispute preserved in humanity's earliest literature, not as a parable, not as allegory, but as the explanation for why the world works the way it does. The Agigi revolted. The Anunnaki needed replacement workers. Humans were created to fill that gap, and from that moment forward, human civilization was built on labor, the same labor the divine workforce had rejected. The hierarchy was preserved. The work continued. But the workers changed. And according to these tablets, that change happened not through natural evolution or divine whimsy, but through an act of collective resistance that forced the gods themselves to negotiate a new arrangement. This is where the Atrahasis epic transitions from describing order to describing rupture. And it's where we need to look more carefully at what actually happened on the night the tools fell silent. 40 days of digging. The number 40 appears frequently in Mesopotamian texts, often signifying a long period rather than a precise count. But in the Atrahasis epic, the length of the Ajigi's labor before their rebellion is specified with unusual care. Some versions say 40 years. Others suggest different periods. What remains consistent is the emphasis on duration. This wasn't brief service, but extended, grinding toil. The work itself was specific. The text doesn't speak in vague terms about service or worship. It details excavation. They were digging watercourses, canals for the life of the land they opened up. This is civil engineering on a massive scale. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers carried water from Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains down through Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. But their natural flow was seasonal, unreliable, and often destructive during flood seasons. Agriculture in southern Mesopotamia required control of this water. Archaeological evidence shows extensive ancient canal networks throughout the region. The Iturungo Canal, excavated by archaeologists near ancient Lagash, stretched for over 30 kilometers. Surveys using aerial photography and satellite imagery have revealed canal systems that once covered thousands of square kilometers, many dating to the early dynastic period around 2900-2350 BCE and earlier. These weren't minor irrigation ditches. Some ancient canals were wide enough to accommodate boat traffic. Others had earthen embankments several meters high. The volume of earth that had to be moved, shaped, and maintained was staggering. And in the early Bronze Age, this work was done with copper and bronze tools, baskets, and human muscle. The Atrahasis text links this labor directly to the Igigi. For 40 years, they bore the drudgery. The toil was heavy, the distress was much. There's a technical Akkadian term used here, dulu, meaning imposed labor or corv work. It's the same term used in royal inscriptions when kings describe mobilizing populations for construction projects. It carries connotations of obligation, not choice. Then the text provides an image that's both simple and devastating. They cried out, making much noise. They complained, denouncing their chief. The Sumerian word for this outcry is rigmu, a word that will become critically important later in the narrative, because it's the same word used to describe humanity's noise that eventually angers the gods and precipitates the flood. But here, at the beginning, it's the gods themselves who are loud, who complain, who demand to be heard. What were they digging toward? The text implies ongoing, never-ending maintenance. Rivers silt, canals fill, embankments erode. Water control in Mesopotamia wasn't a project you completed once. It was infrastructure that demanded constant attention. Mesopotamian royal inscriptions from historical periods are full of kings boasting about canal cleaning, embankment restoration, and waterway maintenance. King Shulgi of Ur, ruling around 2094-2047 BC, claims to have cleaned the canal systems of Sumer. King Hammurabi of Babylon, around 1792-1750 BC, describes extensive canal work in his Law Code prologue. If mortal kings found water management so demanding that they needed to commemorate their efforts in stone and clay, how much more demanding would it have been for the original excavation, for cutting the Tigris and Euphrates themselves, as the text claims? Now, mainstream scholarship reads digging the Tigris and Euphrates as mythological language for establishing the river system in cosmic prehistory, not as literal engineering. The rivers existed naturally. But what if the text is describing something else? What if it's preserving memory of the massive labor investment required to make those rivers useful for civilization? Not creating water flow, but creating the control systems, the channels, canals, reservoirs, and embankments that transformed wild rivers into agricultural infrastructure. Archaeological evidence confirms that civilization in Sumer depended entirely on this infrastructure. Without it, the climate was too dry for reliable farming. Cities couldn't exist. The surplus that supported scribes, priests, craftsmen, and kings couldn't be generated. Everything that made Sumer rested on controlled water, and someone had to do that work. The text describes this work as divine labor performed before humans existed. In mythological reading, that's simply backstory, explaining origins. But consider an alternative reading. What if before humans existed means before our present human civilization? What if there's preserved memory of an earlier civilization, a pre-flood society, that organized labor on a scale we associate with later kingdoms, but that actually preceded them? This is where the text becomes difficult, because the Atrahasis epic presents a sequence: divine labor, divine rebellion, human creation, human multiplication, divine regret, flood, and finally the post-flood world where humans continue the work but under revised conditions. This sequence places human creation firmly in a mythological frame, gods making people from clay. But strip away the divine actors and look at the structural pattern. A laboring class performs infrastructure work under a ruling class. The laborers reach a breaking point and refuse to continue. The rulers need the work done, but can't or won't do it themselves. A new laboring class is recruited or created. The new laborers multiply rapidly and create new problems. The rulers attempt to reduce the laboring population through catastrophe. Some laborers survive and rebuild. The system continues, but both sides have learned something about its limits. This isn't mythology. This is social history, and it's a pattern that repeats throughout human civilization: labor shortages, forced labor systems, population growth, social tension, catastrophe, reorganization. The Atrahasis epic could be reading as mythology about divine beings, or it could be reading as historical memory, using divine figures as placeholders for human actors in a pre-literate past. The text itself doesn't clearly distinguish. It treats the Ajiji as gods, yes, but gods who experience very human problems: exhaustion, resentment, solidarity, collective action. These aren't distant, incomprehensible divine motivations. They're worker experiences. And the numbers matter. The text specifies that the Anunnaki numbered 600, 300 in heaven, 300 on earth and in the netherworld. It doesn't give a precise count of the Ajiji, but implies they were numerous enough to perform massive infrastructure work, and numerous enough that their rebellion posed a genuine threat. When they gathered together, they could surround Enlil's dwelling and make demands. For 40 days, or 40 years, depending on how you read the chronology, they dug, they hauled, they built, they maintained, and at some point, individually or collectively, they decided it was too much. The tools became too heavy. The work became unbearable. And one night, instead of returning to the canals, they did something different. They stopped. The night of burning tools. The Atrahasis epic describes the moment of rebellion with surprising specificity. This isn't a vague reference to divine discontent. It's a sequence of actions, organized and deliberate, that reads less like mythology and more like a chronicle. They set fire to their tools, fire to their spades they put, and flame to their work baskets. Tablet 1, column E, lines 34-35. The image is visceral. Bronze or copper spades, wooden handles, reed baskets, these are the literal implements of canal excavation, and the text says the Ajiji burned them, not discarded them, not laid them aside, burned them, destroyed the very instruments of their labor in an act that could only be interpreted as irreversible refusal. This is symbolic destruction, yes, but it's also practical. Burnt tools can't be easily replaced. In the Bronze Age, metalworking required specialized knowledge, fuel, ore access, and time. You didn't quickly forge replacement spades for a workforce of hundreds or thousands. By burning their tools, the Ajiji weren't just making a statement. They were ensuring they couldn't be immediately forced back to work even if they wanted to. Then they marched. They came near the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator. It was night, in the middle of the watch. The timing is significant. Midnight. When response would be slowest, when surprise would be complete, when the symbolic impact would be maximum. This wasn't random timing. It was strategic. They surrounded the temple. The Akkadian term used is aplu, meaning to encircle or besiege, military language. not protest in a public square, but direct confrontation at the seat of power. Enlil was the god responsible for administering Earth, the one under whose authority the Igigi labored, and now his own workforce surrounded his dwelling in darkness, fire from burning tools lighting the night. The text describes Enlil's response through his vizier Nusku. My lord, your house is surrounded. Fighting has reached your gate. Enlil had weapons brought to his dwelling. The language shifts immediately to martial terms. This isn't framed as a conversation gone wrong or a misunderstanding. It's framed as confrontation, with Enlil preparing for physical conflict. But before violence erupts, Nusku asks a question that changes everything. Nusku spoke to the warrior Enlil, My lord, why do you make war on your own sons? Your quarrel is not with a foreign enemy, it is with the Igigi. The text uses Mru, sons, implying a relationship that should preclude violence, and it explicitly frames what's happening as civil conflict, not external threat. This is where the Atrahasis narrative diverges from simple myth into something more complex. Enlil could have crushed the rebellion by force. He had weapons. He had authority. But instead, he called a council. The text says, Enlil opened his mouth and addressed the great gods. He summoned Anu from heaven and Enki from the Abzu, an emergency assembly of the highest divine authority. And what did the Igigi want? The text records their complaint. Every one of us gods has agreed to call for an accounting. The labor was heavy, the distress was much. Great was the drudgery, and much the hardship. They're not demanding luxury, not asking for status or power. They're demanding relief from unbearable working conditions. This is labor negotiation. But notice what happened when Enlil convened the council. He didn't just hear complaints and make concessions. He asked a question designed to identify leadership. Who is it that started the war? Who is it that made rebellion? The Mesopotamian term tamu means armed conflict, and albru means to rebel or revolt. Enlil wanted names. He wanted to know who organized this. The response is fascinating. The text says the Igigi answered collectively. Every one of us gods has decided together. The labor was too great, the distress too much. We have called for accounting together. No single leader identified. No scapegoat offered. Corporate responsibility claimed by all. This is organized resistance, refusing to break solidarity even under direct interrogation by the highest authority. Now, if you're reading this as straightforward mythology about divine beings, this scene is curious but not extraordinary. Gods can have conflicts. Myths often anthropomorphize divine behavior, but if you read this as preserved memory of human events described in divine language, suddenly this becomes one of the most remarkable documents of labor history ever written, because what it describes is a general strike. Not spontaneous uprising, but coordinated action. Destruction of work equipment to prevent forced resumption. Midnight march to the center of authority. Surround the administrative headquarters. Make collective demands. Refuse to identify leaders to protect everyone from retaliation. And force negotiation rather than accept suppression. These are tactics. Sophisticated tactics that require planning, communication, solidarity, and courage. And they apparently worked, because the next thing that happens in the Atrahasis text is not punishment of the Igigi, but Enlil's question to Enki, what are we going to do? The Anunnaki needed the work done. The Igigi refused to do it. Violence would destroy the workforce entirely, leaving no one to maintain the infrastructure. Concessions would undermine divine authority. and simply ignoring the problem wasn't possible, the gods were surrounded in the middle of the night by their own striking workers. Enki proposed a third option: create new workers, not divine beings with the capacity to rebel, but something different, something that could be shaped, controlled, and replaced if necessary. Mix clay from the Abzu with divine essence, specifically blood from a god who possessed intelligence, and fashion creatures capable of bearing the labor the Ajigi rejected. Create humans. The text describes this proposal and its immediate implementation. But before we examine that creation, we need to sit with what just happened. According to the Atrahasis epic, human beings exist because gods went on strike. We weren't created out of love or divine loneliness or cosmic boredom. We were created as replacement workers, as the solution to a labor crisis precipitated by rebellion. If this is mythology, it's remarkably grim mythology. Most creation stories give humans some dignity, made in divine image, beloved by creator gods, entrusted with purpose. The Atrahasis version is brutally functional. You exist to work. You were designed for it. And the only reason you were needed at all is because the previous workforce successfully refused. But what if this isn't mythology? What if some Sumerian scribe was recording, as accurately as available language and concepts allowed, the memory of an actual restructuring, not of divine labor, but of human civilization, after some catastrophic event that required complete social reorganization? The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies, including the famous Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean Museum, describes kings who ruled before the flood with impossibly long reigns, thousands or tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the king list continues, but with normal human lifespans. Mainstream scholarship reads this as mythology transitioning into history, with the flood as the dividing line between mythical and historical periods. But what if that flood represents real catastrophe, not necessarily global deluge, but regional disaster so complete it destroyed whatever social order existed before, requiring complete rebuilding? And what if the Atrahasis epic preserves the social dynamics of that rebuilding, memory of how labor was reorganized, how populations were reconstituted, how the new post-catastrophe civilization structured itself? In that reading, the Ajiji aren't gods. They're the pre-catastrophe labor force. The Anunnaki aren't gods. They're the ruling class. The rebellion is remembered social upheaval. The flood is catastrophe. And the creation of humans isn't literal formation from clay. It's the emergence of post-catastrophe civilization using new labor organization. This isn't provable. The text uses divine actors throughout. But the pattern underneath, labor, rebellion, negotiation, replacement, reorganization, that pattern is unmistakably human. And the Sumerians recorded it in their most important literary works, not as distant legend, but as the foundational explanation for why their world worked the way it did. The night of burning tools, whether divine or human, whether mythological or historical, represents something profound. The moment when workers said no, when those at the bottom refused those at the top, when the system broke down and had to be rebuilt differently. And according to the text, that moment created us. Enlil's Crisis Council. After the midnight confrontation, after the burning tools and the siege of Enlil's temple, the text describes a divine council, unlike any other in Mesopotamian literature. This wasn't a routine assembly. This was crisis management at the highest level of cosmic authority. Anu opened his mouth and addressed the gods. What exactly is it that we are complaining about? Their work was heavy, their distress was much. Every day the earth resounded, the noise was overwhelming. Tablet 1, Column the 3rd. The supreme god of heaven, Anu himself, acknowledges the legitimacy of the Ajiji complaint. Their work was heavy. Their distress was real. This isn't dismissal, it's validation. But then Anu asks the critical question, is there nothing we can do? The phrasing in Akkadian suggests helplessness, or at least genuine uncertainty. The highest authority in the cosmos doesn't immediately have a solution. The system has broken down, and even divine power doesn't provide an obvious path forward. The council dynamic becomes clear. Anu asks Enlil what to do. Enlil, whose authority was directly challenged by the siege, responds with anger. Some fragments suggest he wanted to identify and punish ringleaders, but Nusku, his vizier, had already reported that the rebellion was collective. No single leader to target, no individual to make an example of. The entire Ijiki workforce acted together. This is when Enki speaks. Enki, god of wisdom and the freshwater abyss, the Abzu. Enki, who, throughout Mesopotamian literature, plays a peculiar role, he's technically subordinate to Anu and Enlil in the divine hierarchy, but he's consistently portrayed as cleverer, more creative, more willing to bend rules to solve problems. In the flood narrative, it's Enki who secretly warns the human survivor. In creation myths, it's Enki who devises the method for forming humanity. He's the problem solver, the engineer, the one who finds third options when confrontation offers only two. And now, facing a labor crisis that threatens the functioning of the entire cosmic order, Enki proposes something radical. While Belet Eli, the womb goddess, is present, let her create a mortal man, so that he may bear the yoke, the toil of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of God. Belet Eli is another name for Ninmah, or Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with birth and fertility. Enki's proposal involves her directly because what he's suggesting is creation of new life, not reshaping existing divine beings, not reorganization of the current workforce, but fashioning entirely new creatures specifically designed for labor. The text is explicit about purpose. These new beings will bear the yoke. They will assume the drudgery of God. The Akkadian term upiku means yoke or burden, the wooden frame placed on draft animals. This isn't subtle metaphor, it's direct functional language. Create beasts of burden that can think and work, solving the labor shortage without creating more potentially rebellious divine beings. The council accepts this proposal. But the method requires something unusual. Enki says, "On the 1st, 7th, and 15th days of the month, let me establish a purification, a bath. Let one god be slaughtered, and let all the gods be cleansed by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay. God and man shall be intimately joined in the clay. For the rest of time, we shall hear the drumbeat of the god." This is the recipe. Clay from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater that Enki controls, blood from a slaughtered god. Mix them together, fashion them into human form. The result will be creatures that are part divine. That's where the intelligence and capability come from, but primarily earthly, limited, controllable. But which god? The text names him. They slaughtered Wei-Ila, who had intelligence in their assembly. With his flesh and blood, Nintu mixed the clay. Some versions call him Geshtu-I. The name means roughly God, who has intelligence or ear of understanding. He wasn't selected randomly. The sacrificed god had to possess the mental capacity that would be needed in the new workers. You couldn't create functional laborers from just any divine material. You needed intelligence, skill, ability to learn and adapt. This raises an immediate question. Why would a god agree to be sacrificed? Or if not agree, how did the council determine which god would die? The text doesn't elaborate, but some fragments suggest Ila may have been the leader of the Ijiji rebellion. If so, the sacrifice becomes more sinister, punishment disguised as necessary ingredient. The ringleader is identified after all, not to be imprisoned or expelled, but to be killed and literally transformed into the workforce that replaces his followers. Other interpretations suggest Ila volunteered, martyring himself so that beings could be created to relieve his fellow Ijiji. In this reading, the sacrifice is noble, willing, ensuring that at least something of divine intelligence and sympathy for labor would be embedded in humanity forever. We would carry the consciousness of a God who understood suffering, who had himself dug the canals and borne the yoke. The text doesn't clearly favor either reading. It simply states that the God who had intelligence was slaughtered in the assembly, his blood and flesh mixed with clay, and from that mixture humanity was fashioned. 14 pieces of clay. 7 formed into males, 7 into females. Nintu, the mother goddess, pinched each piece with expertise, completing each form. Then she spoke an incantation. I have created, my hands have made it. Let the midwife rejoice in the house of the childbearing woman. When the mother gives birth, may she give birth by herself, a human baby. Let her bring forth offspring, that the divine workload may be relieved. This is the moment. According to the Atrahasis epic, this is when humans began, not as beloved children of the gods, not as divinely inspired souls placed in earthly form, but as engineered replacements for striking workers. Our origin story, according to this text, is fundamentally about labor relations. Now, compare this to other creation accounts. In the biblical Genesis, humans are made in the image and likeness of God, given dominion over the earth, blessed to be fruitful. In the Egyptian creation myths, humans emerge from the tears of the sun god Ra, or are spoken into being by the god Ta. In Greek mythology, Prometheus shapes humans from clay and gives them fire as a gift, defying Zeus to help them flourish. Most creation myths grant humans some inherent dignity, some divine favor or cosmic purpose beyond mere utility. The Atrahasis version offers none of that comfort. You exist to work. That's the beginning and end of it. The gods needed laborers. You were designed to fill that need. Your very substance contains the blood of a slaughtered god who bore intelligence. But that intelligence wasn't gift. It was practical necessity. Workers who can't think, can't dig canals properly. Mainstream scholarship treats this as Mesopotamian pragmatism applied to theological questions. Why do humans exist? Because the world requires work. Why must we toil? Because that was our designed function. Its ideological narrative explaining the grim reality of agricultural labor in ancient Sumer, where most people spent most of their lives doing backbreaking work under the authority of temple and palace hierarchies. But again, consider the alternative reading. What if this text preserves memory of actual social reorganization, After catastrophe, after the collapse of whatever pre-flood civilization existed, survivors had to rebuild. Labor had to be organized. Fields had to be cleared, canals dug, walls built, infrastructure recreated. The post-catastrophe population, reduced, traumatized, starting over, these would be the newly created humans. Not literally formed from clay, but reformed, reorganized, given new social structures and new relationships to labor. In this reading, the Council of the Gods is the Council of Elders, or surviving leadership. The decision to create humans is the decision to organize the surviving population into a workforce. The sacrifice of Wee-La might be literal, a leader killed in the upheaval, or symbolic, the old social order dying to allow new organization. The mixing of divine blood with clay becomes metaphor for creating a new kind of society, one that combines leadership intelligence with earthly practicality. Either way, mythological or historical, the text describes labor as humanity's foundation, and it describes that labor as originating in someone else's refusal to continue. The Ajiji said no, and we came into being, which means, according to this narrative, we carry within us both the intelligence of divine ancestry and the memory of rebellion that precipitated our creation. That's not a comfortable origin story, but it's the one the Sumerians preserved in their most important literary works. And they didn't preserve it as ancient history. They preserved it as present explanation. This is why you work. This is why civilization requires labor. This is why the hierarchy exists, not because it's just, but because it was negotiated in the aftermath of crisis, and this is what was decided. The council concluded. Nintu completed her work. Humanity was created. The Igigi were released from their labor, and the great canals, the infrastructure that made civilization possible, would now be maintained by mortal hands. The work continued, but the workers changed, and from that moment, according to the text, the history of humanity began. But it began with someone else's strike echoing in our blood. The solution from the abyss. The method of human creation deserves closer examination, because the details matter. This wasn't divine speech calling beings into existence. It wasn't breath animating dust. It was procedure, recipe, technical process documented with the precision of a temple workshop manual. Enki, as the architect of this solution, provided specific instructions. The process required 3 key elements: clay from the Abzu, blood and flesh from the sacrificed god Wee-La, and the technical skill of Ninmah, the birth goddess. But it also required timing, ritual purity, and collective divine participation. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th days of the month, let me establish a purification bath. These are astronomically significant dates in the Mesopotamian calendar. The first day is the new moon. The 7th is the first quarter. The 15th is the full moon. These aren't random days. They're the points where lunar phases shift, where one cycle transitions to another. The timing suggests this wasn't ordinary work, but sacred transformation, requiring cosmic alignment. The purification bath involved all the gods. Let all the gods be cleansed by immersion. Before creating something new, the creators themselves had to be ritually clean. Mesopotamian religious practice was obsessive about purity. Priests bathed multiple times daily. Temple entry required washing. Sacred objects couldn't be handled with unwashed hands. The Sumerians believed that impurity contaminated not just physically, but spiritually, disrupting the proper function of divine power. So before fashioning humanity, the divine assembly purified themselves. Then, in that state of ritual cleanliness, they proceeded to sacrifice We'ila. The text describes this with disturbing matter of factness. They slaughtered We'ila in their assembly. No description of objection from We'ila. No struggle, no divine hesitation. The assembly decided, and the god who possessed intelligence was killed so his essence could be used. His blood was collected, his flesh was taken, and Ninmah mixed these with clay. The Akkadian verb used is balu, meaning to mix thoroughly, to blend until components are indistinguishable. This wasn't clay with blood poured on top. This was intimate incorporation, divine substance and earthly material becoming one substance. The text emphasizes this unity. God and man shall be joined together in the clay. Ninmah, also called Nintu or Belet Ili depending on the source and period, took the mixture and divided it into 14 portions, 7 male, 7 female. Each portion was shaped by hand. The text uses alamtu, meaning to form or mold, the same word used for sculptors working clay or craftsmen shaping metal. Physical, deliberate shaping, not mystical transformation, but manufacture. Then comes an interesting detail. Ninmah pinched off 14 pieces of clay and called the wise midwife goddesses. She enlisted help, 7 midwife goddesses to oversee the 7 male forms, 7 more for the 7 female forms. These weren't lesser assistants, but specialists, goddesses specifically associated with childbirth and the maintenance of pregnancy. Their presence suggests the creation wasn't a single moment, but an extended process, requiring expertise in gestation and delivery. The text says, "In the house of the birthing woman, let the bricks be set in place for 7 days." This is peculiar phrasing until you understand Mesopotamian birthing practices. Women in labor sat on special birthing bricks, squatting over them during delivery. The bricks provided stable support and proper positioning. By mentioning birthing bricks in 7 days, the text implies humanity wasn't instantly formed, but went through something like gestation. The clay figures mixed with divine blood were placed in a birthing house and attended by midwife goddesses for 7 days. Then birth occurred. The wise midwife called out, "I have created. My hands have completed it." She called the mother of the god. She summoned the wise Nintu and said, "You gave me the task, and I have completed it. You created the birth goddess. Let the mother carry the offspring. Let her lay upon man the work of God." This is the moment the text marks as human origin, not the initial mixing of clay and blood, not the shaping of forms, but the successful delivery after 7 days of divine gestation. Humanity was born, literally, from divine mothers. And immediately, before celebration, before any acknowledgement of what had been created, the purpose is stated, "Let her lay upon man the work of God." The work. Always the work. That's why this creation happened. That's the human function. The Igigi were relieved, because their workload was now transferred to these new beings. The canals would still be dug, the embankments maintained, the fields irrigated, but mortal hands would do it under divine supervision, rather than divine hands doing it under divine resentment. An interesting question. What did the Igigi think of this solution? The text doesn't say. After the human creation sequence, the Igigi largely disappear from the narrative. They're mentioned occasionally in later literature, but not as laborers. Some texts place them in the heavens, associated with celestial phenomena. Others put them in the underworld. They're never again described as the workforce of the gods. They successfully escaped their labor, and the texts respect that escape by removing them from the story. But humans remain, and almost immediately the text describes us multiplying. 1,200 years had not passed when the country became too wide, the people too numerous. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise. That same word again. Rigmu. Noise, uproar, clamor. The exact term used to describe the Ajiji's complaints during their rebellion. Now it describes humanity. We were created to solve a problem, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. Instead, we grew numerous and loud. We became the very thing the Ajiji rebellion had been, a disturbance to divine peace. This sets up the rest of the Atrahasis epic, which describes repeated divine attempts to reduce human population. First disease, then drought, then infertility. All failed because Enki, who designed humans in the first place, kept subverting the attempts by teaching humans how to respond. Finally, Enlil decreed the flood, not to punish human wickedness, as in the biblical version, but to eliminate human noise, to solve the overpopulation problem permanently. But before we address that catastrophe, consider what the creation account itself reveals. The Sumerians believed, or recorded that previous generations believed, that humanity was designed for labor, that we contain divine intelligence because workers need intelligence, that we were born from goddesses because creating life requires divine feminine power, that we came into being not through love or whim, but through calculated response to labor crisis. This is industrial thinking, engineering thinking, problem solving that treats creation as production, and it's preserved in texts that date to at least 1700 BC, possibly earlier based on oral traditions that predated writing. These aren't modern concepts imposed on ancient texts. These are ancient concepts that sound eerily modern to us. Moreover, the creation account in Atrahasis shares elements with other Mesopotamian creation texts, but differs in crucial ways. In Enuma Elish, humanity is created from the blood of Chingu, the rebel god who led the war against Marduk. In Enki and Ninmah, the creation is almost playful, with the gods having a contest to see who can make the most functional humans despite handicaps. But in Atrahasis, the creation is purely pragmatic. No rebellion from the created humans precipitating it, rebellion from divine workers. No contest or test, just need and solution. The Atrahasis version is the bleakest, the most labor-focused, the least adorned with theological justification, and significantly, it's the version most closely tied to the flood narrative. Creation and catastrophe are directly linked, both driven by the same dynamic, divine need for work, human capacity to become too numerous and disruptive, and catastrophe as population control. If you're reading this as mythology, it's disturbing mythology that offers humans little cosmic dignity. If you're reading it as preserved history encoded in mythological language, it's disturbing history that suggests pre-flood civilization was built on labor exploitation that eventually became unsustainable, leading to catastrophic collapse. Either way, the message is consistent. Work defines human existence. We were made for it. Our gods, literal or figurative, designed us for it. Our very substance, mixed with divine intelligence, ensures we have just enough capability to be useful, but just enough limitation to remain controllable. We are, according to this text, the solution to someone else's successful rebellion. And that solution, the Sumerians believed, explained everything about why their world functioned as it did, why temples controlled labor, why palaces mobilized populations for infrastructure projects, why irrigation systems required constant maintenance, why social hierarchy placed workers at the bottom and administrators at the top. Not because anyone wanted it that way, but because that was the original design. The solution from the Abzu, clay and blood, mixed by divine hands, gestated in a birthing house, delivered by midwife goddesses, wasn't salvation. It was settlement. A negotiated compromise after crisis. The Ajiji won their freedom. The Anunnaki maintained their authority. And humanity inherited the work both sides wanted to avoid. The question that haunts this text is whether the Sumerians recording this story saw themselves as victims or heirs. Were they resentful of a cosmic order that placed labor at the center of human purpose, or did they see nobility in being entrusted with work that once belonged to gods? The text doesn't answer clearly. It simply describes. And in that description, we see people trying to understand why their lives were shaped by endless toil, and finding an answer that was at least coherent, even if it wasn't comforting. We exist because someone else refused to do what we do. That's the core of the Atrahasis creation account. And once you've read it, you can't forget it. Every time you work, every time you see infrastructure, every time you consider who builds and who benefits, that origin story whispers in the background. You exist because gods went on strike. You were designed to solve their labor dispute. And the work you do every day is the work they refuse to continue. The solution from the abyss wasn't mercy. It was management, and it's been functioning for 4,000 years of recorded human history exactly as designed. The sacrificed god. Among all the gods named in Mesopotamian literature, Ila is perhaps the most tragic and the most forgotten. He appears in one crucial moment, his death, and then vanishes. But that single moment is so significant that without it, according to the Atrahasis text, humanity couldn't exist. Different versions of the text use different names. In some Old Babylonian fragments, he's called We-Ilah, in others, Geshtu-E, in late Assyrian versions, sometimes Ilawela, but the meaning is consistent, God who has intelligence or God of understanding. His defining characteristic wasn't power or beauty or rulership, it was intelligence, cognitive capacity, the ability to think, plan, learn, and solve problems. And it was that intelligence the Anunnaki needed for their new workforce. You can create beings strong enough to dig canals from ordinary clay, but beings capable of maintaining complex irrigation systems, understanding seasonal flooding patterns, adapting tools to changing conditions, organizing collective labor, that requires intelligence. And intelligence in the cosmology of ancient Mesopotamia was divine substance. It came from the gods, not from earth. So to make intelligent workers, the gods needed divine material. Specifically, they needed a god who possessed the kind of intelligence that would be useful for labor. We-Ilah apparently fit that requirement. The text describes him as having Mu, a Mesopotamian concept that combines consciousness, understanding, rationality, and craftsman skill. It's the cognitive capacity that separates mindless from purposeful action. The question the text never directly addresses is why We-Ilah. Was he selected? Did he volunteer? Was he punished? Some scholarly interpretations suggest he might have been the leader of the Ajiji rebellion. Making his sacrifice a kind of execution, the ringleader is identified and eliminated. But his elimination serves a purpose beyond mere punishment. His blood and intelligence become the solution to the very crisis his rebellion created. Other interpretations, more sympathetic, suggest Wi'ila offered himself. Seeing that his fellow Igigi had won their freedom, but that the work still needed doing, he martyred himself so that new beings could be created with enough divine essence to function, but not enough divine power to threaten the hierarchy. In this reading, Wi'ila is humanity's patron, the god who sacrificed himself so we could exist, and so his fellow laborers could be free. The text doesn't favor either reading. It states simply, they slaughtered Wi'ila, who had intelligence, in their assembly. The verb is deku, to kill or slay, used for both warfare and sacrifice. No description of his response, no last words, no struggle or submission. Just divine death in the assembly of gods, conducted collectively so that no single god bore responsibility. His blood was caught, his flesh was taken. Both were mixed with clay from the Abzu until God and earth became indistinguishable. Then that mixture was divided into 14 portions, and from those portions, shaped by Ninma's hands, humanity emerged, which means every human, according to this text, carries Wi'ila's intelligence. His consciousness is our consciousness. His understanding is our understanding. His death is why we can think at all. This is radically different from other creation myths. In Genesis, God breathes into Adam's nostrils, and man becomes a living soul. Consciousness comes from divine breath, given freely. In Greek mythology, Prometheus shapes humans from clay and water, but gives them fire from heaven, knowledge stolen from Zeus. Intelligence is gift or theft, but not divine sacrifice. In Atrahasis, intelligence is literal incorporation. A god was killed so that his cognitive capacity could be distributed among newly created beings. This isn't metaphor for divine inspiration. This is visceral, physical transfer. You think because Wi'ila died, your rationality cost a god his existence. Consider the theological implications. If a god must die for humans to possess intelligence, then intelligence isn't natural to earthly beings. It's foreign substance, grafted in, never fully belonging. We are, by design, hybrids, part earth, which gives us limitation and mortality, part divine, which gives us consciousness and capability. Neither fully one nor fully the other, but mixed thoroughly until the components can't be separated. This explains something that troubled later Mesopotamian philosophy and literature: human mortality combined with human awareness. We know we're going to die. We can contemplate our own non-existence. We can create beauty, meaning, civilization, and art. We can understand cosmic order. But we can't escape death. Gods are immortal, but consciously so. Animals die, but aren't aware of mortality in the way humans are. Only humans possess both consciousness and doom, and according to Atrahasis, that combination exists because we're made from dying God, mixed with mortal clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores this tension. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, is obsessed with mortality. After his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh seeks immortality desperately, refusing to accept that death is part of his nature. His quest fails. He learns that humans were allotted death when they were created, and no amount of divine ancestry, even 2/3, can change that. The tavern keeper, Siduri, tells him, when the gods created mankind, death they dispensed to mankind, life they kept for themselves. But Atrahasis adds a darker detail. Not only did gods keep immortality for themselves, they actively created mortality by mixing divine substance with earthly substance. Wi'ila was immortal. Clay is temporary. Combine them, and you get beings who have divine consciousness trapped in mortal forms, which is arguably cruelty. To be aware enough to contemplate eternity, but limited enough to experience only decades. Was this intentional design or necessary compromise? Did the Anunnaki want workers who knew they would die, making them easier to control? Or was mortality the inevitable result of mixing incompatible substances? Gods can't fully become mortal, but mortals can receive fragments of divine consciousness. The text doesn't clarify intent, only outcome. Wi'ila's sacrifice accomplished the Anunnaki's goal. They got an intelligent workforce, but that workforce inherited something else from their divine ancestor, the consciousness of suffering. Wi'ila bore the labor that the Ajiji found unbearable. His consciousness, developed in the context of divine toil, and when his blood was mixed into humanity, that consciousness came with it, which means, according to this narrative, we don't just carry intelligence, we carry labor consciousness, the awareness of work as burden, the capacity to recognize when toil is too much. We carry the consciousness of a god who dug canals, and if Wi'ila was the rebellion leader, then we carry rebellion consciousness too. The capacity to recognize injustice, the ability to organize collective refusal, the intelligence that can plan coordinated action against authority. The gods wanted workers intelligent enough to be useful. But intelligence, once given, can't be limited only to approved uses. It thinks independently. It questions. It refuses. This might explain why, in the Atrahasis narrative, humanity becomes a problem almost immediately. We multiply too quickly. We become too noisy. We disrupt divine peace just as the Ajiji did before us, because we have the same consciousness they had, derived from Wi'ila, who understood labor and the limits of endurance. The gods thought they were creating replacements. Instead, they created heirs to the rebellion. Not immediately, not in the first generation, but inherently embedded in our divine clay substance. Wi'ila's death ensured we would have the capacity to eventually do what he or his fellow Igigi did, refuse. The text doesn't say this explicitly, but it describes a pattern: divine labor, divine rebellion, human creation with divine substance, human multiplication and noise, divine regret, catastrophic flood. The pattern suggests that giving humans intelligence was a miscalculation. The Anunnaki thought they could create obedient workers, but by using a god who understood labor and suffering, they embedded resistance into the human psyche. Wi'ila, then, whether executed rebel or willing martyr, gave humanity more than consciousness. He gave us the capacity for refusal, the intelligence to recognize when we're being exploited, the consciousness that labor has limits, the understanding that work can be rejected. These aren't learned behaviors, they're embedded in our substance, according to the text. Wi'ila's blood carries them, and that blood flows through every human being. The Sumerians preserved this story, maintained it across centuries, translated it, copied it, considered it important enough to include in their core literature. Why? If this were only ideological myth explaining labor, you wouldn't need Wi'ila. You could have gods create humans from plain clay, declaring them workers by fiat. But instead, the story includes divine sacrifice, mixing of substances, transfer of intelligence that comes with unintended consequences. Perhaps the Sumerians were grappling with a genuine mystery. Why do we work, and why do we resent work? Why are we capable of incredible ingenuity applied to labor, but also capable of organizing to refuse that labor? Why does intelligence serve authority, but also question authority? The answer, according to Atrahasis, is that we carry contradictory inheritance. We're made to work, but made from a God who rebelled against work. We're designed for submission, but contain consciousness that enables resistance. Ila's sacrifice wasn't just creation of humanity, it was embedding of conflict into humanity. And that conflict between obedience and refusal, between accepting our created purpose and rejecting it, that conflict has defined human civilization since the beginning. Not because we're fallen or broken, but because we're mixed. Divine intelligence in mortal clay. Consciousness of freedom trapped in bodies designed for labor. The Sumerians didn't resolve this. Their texts don't offer escape or transcendence. They simply describe the situation and suggest it's been this way from the start. Ila died so we could think. And because we can think, we can resist. The same gift that makes us useful makes us dangerous. The intelligence that maintains canals can also burn tools and surround temples at midnight. We are Ila's heirs. Every time we work, we remember him. Every time we refuse to work, we honor him. His blood moves in us, divine and mortal, conscious of both capacity and limitation, aware that we were created for a purpose, but capable of imagining different purposes. The gods sacrificed Ila to solve a labor crisis, but in solving that crisis, they ensured it would never truly end. Because we carry within us the consciousness of the very rebellion they sought to prevent. That's Ila's legacy. That's humanity's inheritance. Intelligence that can serve or resist, depending on conditions and choices. And the Atrahasis text, written 4,000 years ago on clay tablets, preserved this understanding with remarkable clarity. We're not simple creatures. We're hybrid beings, mixed from incompatible substances, carrying consciousness that doesn't quite fit our mortal limits. Ila made us possible. And in making us possible, he made our perpetual dissatisfaction inevitable. The sacrifice God didn't die to give us peace. He died to give us the capacity to recognize when peace is absent. And that recognition, more than anything else, defines the human condition as the Sumerians understood it. We know what we're missing because a God who knew what he was missing gave us his blood, and we can't forget. Because that blood still carries memory. What happened to the Igigi? After the creation of humanity, after their labor was transferred to mortal shoulders, the Igigi vanish from the Atrahasis narrative. They achieved their goal, freedom from unbearable work, and then the texts move on to other concerns. But their disappearance raises questions. Where did they go? What role did they assume in the divine hierarchy after winning their strike? Did they remain subordinate to the Anunnaki, or did their successful rebellion earn them elevated status? The textual evidence is fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. In early Sumerian sources, the Igigi aren't clearly distinguished from the Anunnaki. The terms seem almost interchangeable, both referring to the collective divine assembly. But by the Old Babylonian period, when the Atrahasis epic was composed around 1700 BC, the distinction is sharp. Anunnaki are the great gods, the decision makers, the ruling council. Igigi are lesser gods, workers, subordinates who labor under Anunnaki authority. Then, after the creation of humanity, that clear distinction becomes muddled again. Later texts from the Middle Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian periods sometimes place the Igigi in the heavens, associated with celestial phenomena, stars, planets, and astronomical cycles. Other texts place them in the underworld, alongside the Anunnaki, who are judges of the dead. The Igigi become vague, their role uncertain, their specific identity lost in cosmic reorganization. One interpretation, the Igigi were absorbed into the Anunnaki class after their rebellion. Having proven they couldn't be forced into servile labor, they were granted status elevation. The divine workforce became divine administrators, freed from digging canals to supervise the human workers who now dug them. This would parallel human social mobility, skilled laborers becoming overseers, foremen, managers. The Igigi kept their divine nature, but changed their function within the hierarchy. Supporting this reading, some late texts use Igigi and Anunnaki as synonyms for the great gods, without clear distinction. In prayers and invocations, Igigi and Anunnaki becomes a formulaic phrase meaning all the gods, both groups treated with equal reverence. If the Igigi were once laborers but became administrators after their strike succeeded, then the blurring of terminological distinction makes sense. Former workers and former rulers became a unified divine class, both supervising human labor. But there's a darker possibility. Several texts describe divine beings, sometimes identified as Igigi, who are bound or imprisoned in the underworld. The Epic of Era, preserved on British Museum tablet K1282, mentions divine beings confined below, unable to rise. The Descent of Inanna describes judges in the underworld who pass sentence on even gods. Some scholars suggest these confined divine beings might be Igigi, who were punished after all, not immediately, perhaps, but once humans were successfully integrated as workers and divine authority was reestablished. In this reading, the Igigi won a temporary victory. They forced the creation of replacement workers. But once humans proved functional, the Anunnaki didn't forgive the rebellion. The Igigi were quietly removed from positions of potential power and relegated to the underworld, bound there as punishment or precaution. Their freedom lasted only until the system they disrupted was repaired with new labor sources. Then they were eliminated from active participation in cosmic administration. The evidence for this is circumstantial. No text explicitly describes Igigi imprisonment as punishment for rebellion, but the pattern is suggestive. Pre-rebellion, Igigi clearly identified as active workers. Post-rebellion, Igigi vague, displaced, sometimes confined, no longer active in the narratives that describe divine activity on Earth. It's negative evidence, the absence of Igigi where you'd expect to find them if they remained free and functional. A third possibility, more esoteric, emerges from astronomical texts. Late Babylonian astronomy associates certain gods with celestial bodies. The Igigi sometimes appear in these contexts as stellar or planetary deities. If the Igigi were literally elevated to the heavens, removed from Earth entirely and assigned to the upper cosmic regions, then their disappearance from terrestrial narratives makes sense. They're still active, but in a different realm, maintaining cosmic order at the celestial rather than earthly level. This reading makes the rebellion's success almost literal ascension. The Igigi labored on Earth, digging rivers and canals. They rebelled. As resolution, they were removed from earthly labor and placed in the heavens, overseeing stars and planets, work that is perhaps more dignified or at least further from the Anunnaki authorities they defied. It's exile and reward simultaneously. They get freedom from canal digging, but also separation from the seats of power where decisions are made. The problem is that none of these interpretations are clearly supported by explicit textual statements. The Igigi simply disappear from the narrative after humanity is created, and later references to them are scattered, ambiguous, and don't clearly track what happened to the original Igigi workforce that rebelled in the Atrahasis epic. It's as if the scribes who copied and transmitted these texts deliberately avoided the question. Why? Perhaps because the question was uncomfortable. If the Igigi were rewarded with elevated status, that validates rebellion as effective strategy, which ruling classes prefer not to validate. If the Igigi were punished after their apparent victory, that's cynical and raises questions about divine justice. If the Igigi were simply scattered and removed, that's anticlimactic and doesn't provide satisfying resolution. So the texts avoid resolution, letting the Igigi fade into obscurity after their crucial moment. But consider what that obscurity implies. The Igigi changed everything. Their rebellion directly caused humanity's creation, according to the Atrahasis text. They're responsible for the existence of every person who has ever lived. They successfully defied the highest cosmic authority and forced systemic change. And then they vanish from the story, their fate unrecorded, their names largely forgotten except in specialized scholarly literature. That's a particular kind of erasure, effective erasure. The rebellion is preserved. You can't tell the creation story without it, but the rebels themselves disappear. Their victory is acknowledged as catalyst, but their reward or punishment isn't tracked. Future generations remember the rebellion but not the rebels. Remember the system change, but not the agents who forced that change. This pattern is familiar in human history. Revolutionary leaders who destabilize old systems but then become inconvenient to new systems. Labor organizers whose strikes succeed but whose names are forgotten while the reforms they won are attributed to benevolent authorities. Rebels written out of official histories except as anonymous forces that created circumstances for other agents to resolve. If the Sumerians were recording human history using divine figures as placeholders, then the disappearance of the Igigi parallels how human rebels disappear from historical record, even when their rebellions have lasting impact. The memory preserves the event but obscures the individuals, protecting future stability by not creating martyrs or heroes who might inspire further rebellion. Alternatively, if these are straightforward divine myths, then the Igigi disappearance might simply reflect theological reorganization. As Mesopotamian religion evolved over centuries, divine hierarchies shifted. Gods important in one period became minor in another. Cult centers rose and fell. The Igigi might have simply become theologically irrelevant as Babylonian religion coalesced around major deities like Marduk, Ishtar, Nabu, and Sin. Their rebellion remained important for explaining creation, but their ongoing presence wasn't necessary for later religious practice. What we can say with certainty is this: the Igigi were important enough to name, important enough to give distinct identity, important enough that their labor and rebellion drive the central narrative of one of Mesopotamia's core mythological texts. But after that crucial moment, they become background figures at best, absent at worst. Texts that meticulously track divine genealogies, relationships, and jurisdictions become vague about Igigi status. Scribes who carefully recorded which gods controlled which aspects of reality don't clearly assign post-rebellion roles to the Igigi. That vagueness might be the most telling detail. The Igigi succeeded, but their success didn't lead to clear integration into the power structure that recorded and transmitted texts. They're remembered only for their rebellion, not for what came after, and that selective memory suggests their success was threatening enough that later authorities, priestly scribes, temple administrators, whoever maintained and copied these texts, chose not to celebrate or even clearly document what the Ajiji gained from their defiance. We know the Ajiji won their freedom from canal labor. We know humans replaced them. We know the system adapted to their refusal. But we don't know what they won beyond that freedom, or whether that freedom was later revoked, or whether they were promoted, or punished, or exiled. The texts are silent, and that silence is its own kind of answer. The Ajiji changed the world. Then they disappeared from the story of that world. They're the forgotten revolutionaries of cosmic history, present only as catalyst for human creation, absent from all the narratives that follow. And perhaps that's appropriate, because we, their replacements, have inherited both their work and their erasure. We labor as they once did. And when we resist, when we refuse, when we organize to demand better, we often disappear from official histories too, preserved only as anonymous forces, problems solved by authorities' wisdom rather than workers' courage. The Ajiji's legacy isn't elevation or punishment or clear resolution. It's ambiguity. They proved that even divine systems can be disrupted by collective refusal. They demonstrated that workers, even divinely ordained workers, have limits and can enforce those limits. And then they vanished, leaving us to wonder whether their victory was real or temporary, complete or pyrrhic, rewarded or revenged. That uncertainty might be the text's deepest wisdom. Rebellion can succeed. Systems can change. But what comes after is never guaranteed. The Ajiji burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple and forced the creation of humanity. And then, having changed cosmic history forever, they disappeared into textual silence. History remembers the rebellion. It forgets the rebels. And we who carry Ila's consciousness in our mixed clay and blood substance inherit that pattern too. Our collective actions can shift systems, but our individual fates often vanish into historical ambiguity. The Ajiji are gone. Their story ends with human creation, but the questions they raise persist. What happens to successful rebels after their rebellion? Do systems reward defiance that proves justified, or do systems find ways to punish defiance retroactively once stability is restored? The Atrahasis epic doesn't answer. It simply moves forward to the next phase, humanity multiplying, becoming noisy, disturbing the divine peace, and precipitating new crises that will require new solutions. The Ajiji started that cycle, but they don't appear in its continuation. They're the absent catalyst, the forgotten beginning, the rebellion that changed everything but left no clear trace of the rebels themselves. And if the Sumerians recording this story saw that parallel to their own lives, where collective action might win temporary changes but individual laborers remain anonymous and replaceable, then perhaps the Ajiji's disappearance was the text's most honest element. Not mythology, but observation. Not fantasy, but documentation of how systems erase the individuals who challenge them, even when those challenges succeed. We replaced the Ajiji. We carry their intelligence. We inherited their work, but we also inherited their erasure. The texts remember them only as the problem that required humanity as solution. Everything else about them, their names, their fates, their reward or punishment, is gone. And we, fashioned from Ila's sacrificed consciousness, mixed with Abzu clay, continue the work they refused, knowing we might face the same obscurity if we try to refuse it ourselves. That's the Ajigi's true legacy. Not liberation, but the demonstration that even successful liberation leaves uncertain aftermath. The tools burn. The rebellion succeeds. And then history moves on, rarely pausing to record what happened to those who made history change. The Ajigi proved change is possible. But they also demonstrated that possibility doesn't guarantee permanence. Systems adapt, narratives shift, and rebels, divine or human, often vanish from the stories they forced into being, the noise that wouldn't stop. Humanity was created to solve a problem quietly. The Ajiji had been too loud with their complaints, too disruptive with their refusal. The Anunnaki wanted workers who would labor without protest, who would maintain the infrastructure of civilization without disturbing divine peace. But the Atrahasis epic describes something the gods apparently didn't anticipate. Humans multiplied. 1,200 years had not passed. The country became too wide, the people too numerous. The Akkadian text uses Mtu Rapu, literally land wide or country spread out, suggesting population expansion beyond original bounds. And immediately following population growth, the text describes sound. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. That comparison is jarring. A bellowing bull isn't the sound of speech or music or celebration. It's raw animal noise, loud, continuous, overwhelming. The text is saying humanity produced sound on a massive scale, sound that filled the land like animal roaring. And that sound disturbed the gods. The god was annoyed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise. He addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too much. I lose sleep over their racket. The word is Rigmu again, the same term used for the Ajigi's complaints during their rebellion. Now it describes humanity. We were supposed to be the quiet replacement workforce, but we became as loud as those we replaced. The solution to noise became noise itself. The Anunnaki's plan to restore divine peace by creating human laborers failed, because humans turned out to be noisy too. What exactly was this noise? The text doesn't specify speech or complaint. It describes population density producing sound. Some scholars interpret this as literally acoustic. Ancient cities were densely packed, acoustically chaotic places. Without modern sound insulation, urban noise would have been constant. Markets, workshops, construction, children, animals, religious festivals, all creating overlapping soundscapes. Mesopotamian cities like Uruk-Ur and Nippur housed tens of thousands of people in relatively small areas. The noise level would have been genuinely overwhelming by modern standards. But Rigmu carries connotations beyond simple sound. It can mean tumult, uproar, clamor, words that suggest disorder as much as volume. The Ajiji's Rigmu was their complaint, their protest. If humanity's Rigmu mirrors that, perhaps it's not just sound, but dissatisfaction. Not just people being loud, but people being discontent. Population growth leading to social unrest, competition for resources, challenges to authority. The noise that disturbs gods might be the noise of human society becoming too complex, too independent, too difficult to control. Enlil's complaint is revealing, I lose sleep over their racket. Sleep deprivation from noise sounds trivial until you consider what sleep meant in Mesopotamian theology. Gods required rest. Temple liturgies included rituals for divine rest. Priests were responsible for ensuring gods weren't disturbed. If the divine household couldn't sleep, the cosmos itself was disrupted. Enlil's sleep deprivation isn't personal annoyance, It's cosmic malfunction. The fundamental order requires divine rest, and humanity is preventing it. But why is population growth itself a problem? The text says 1,200 years passed before this became an issue. In Mesopotamian chronology, those numbers are likely symbolic rather than literal, representing long periods, perhaps several generations. Initially, humans were few, manageable, useful. They did the work. They maintained the canals. The system functioned. But as we multiplied, something changed. More people meant more mouths to feed, which meant more intensive agriculture, which meant more water management, which meant more labor coordination. More people meant more complexity. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Cities required administration, food storage, defense, craft specialization, trade networks. What began as simple labor, dig canals, plant fields, harvest crops, became civilization. And civilization is noisy, complicated, and difficult to control. The gods created workers. They got civilization builders. And civilization, once it reaches a certain complexity, develops autonomy. It doesn't just respond to divine decree. It generates its own logic, its own dynamics, its own problems and solutions. Humans weren't just digging canals anymore. We were organizing societies, building walls, creating pottery and textiles and tools, developing writing and mathematics and law, establishing kingdoms and priesthoods. We were doing far more than the Igigi ever did, and we were doing it without divine supervision requesting permission for every innovation. That's threatening, not to modern sensibilities, but to a hierarchical worldview where cosmic order depends on everyone staying in their assigned place. The Igigi rebelled, but they rebelled as gods against gods. Humans were supposed to be fundamentally different, lower, controllable, incapable of challenging divine authority. But if humans multiply into complex civilizations, if our noise becomes like divine noise, if our population makes us too numerous to control easily, then we're not safely subordinate anymore. We're potentially disruptive. Enlil's response is to reduce human population. The text describes a series of plagues sent to accomplish this. First disease, let the egg disease break out. Then drought, let the rain from heaven be withheld. Below let the flood not come up from the abyss. Then infertility, let the womb of the woman be too tight to let out a baby. Each plague is designed to reduce population without destroying humanity entirely. Not genocide, but population control. Keep humans numerous enough to be useful, but not so numerous they become unmanageable. And significantly, each plague fails because Enki, who created humans in the first place, teaches humanity how to respond. When disease comes, Enki tells humans to worship Namtar, the plague god, exclusively, focusing all offerings on him. The plague god, honored by concentrated worship, relents. When drought comes, Enki teaches humans to worship Adad, the storm god. Rain returns. When wombs close, Enki provides rituals to honor the birth goddesses. Enki keeps subverting Enlil's population control. Why? The text doesn't make his motivation explicit, but the pattern is clear. Enki has affection for or investment in humanity that Enlil lacks. Enki designed us. Enki mixed the clay and blood. Enki provided the formula for our creation. We're his project, and he's not willing to let Enlil destroy that project even if population growth is causing problems. This creates divine conflict. Enlil wants fewer humans. Enki wants humans to survive and thrive. The other gods are caught between competing divine authorities. and humans, caught in the middle of divine politics, survive each plague only to multiply again, making the problem worse from Enlil's perspective. Finally, after 3 failed attempts at gradual population reduction, Enlil proposes something drastic. Let there be a flood, not disease or drought or infertility, total catastrophe. Not population control, but population elimination. I will destroy them, wipe out their seed. Let the flood come up. Let it sweep away humankind. Let it destroy them. This is the Mesopotamian flood narrative, and it's driven not by human wickedness as in the biblical account where God regrets making humans because they're evil, but by human noise. We disturbed divine peace. We multiplied beyond useful numbers. We became too complex, too numerous, too loud. So the divine solution was elimination. Reset the system. Remove the noise. Start over with a much smaller post-flood population that could be more easily controlled. But even this plan faces subversion. Enki, continuing his pattern of protecting humanity, secretly warns Atrahasis, the hero whose name means exceedingly wise. Enki tells him to build a boat, gather his family and animals, seal it with pitch, and survive the coming catastrophe. He does this despite swearing an oath not to warn humans. He finds a loophole. He doesn't tell Atrahasis directly, but speaks to the wall of Atrahasis's reed house, and Atrahasis overhears. Technically, Enki didn't break his oath. Actually, he ensured human survival. The flood comes. The text describes it with visceral detail. The gods were frightened by the deluge. The Anunnaki wept. Even the gods who decreed the flood are horrified by its reality. They retreat to the highest heaven and crouch there like dogs, the text says, cowering from the destruction they unleashed. Nintu, the mother goddess who helped create humanity, mourns, "How could I agree to this destruction? My people have been destroyed." The divine assembly experiences regret, but too late. The flood is already happening, and they can't stop it. 7 days. That's how long the flood lasts, according to the Atrahasis version. 7 days of total destruction. When it ends, when the waters recede, Atrahasis emerges from his boat and immediately offers sacrifice to the gods. The smell of the sacrifice draws the gods like starving people. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods crowded like flies around the sacrifice. They're hungry. They've been without offerings for 7 days because humans who provide offerings were almost entirely eliminated. This detail is crucial. Gods needed humans, not just for canal digging, but for worship, for sacrifice, for the food and attention that divine existence apparently required. By eliminating humans, the gods eliminated their own sustenance. Enlil wanted quiet, but got starvation. The noise was annoying, but without humans, the divine household couldn't function. Enlil arrives at the sacrifice and is furious to discover survivors. How did any man escape? No human was to survive. But the other gods defend Atrahasis and Enki's intervention. Nintu says, "Without Enki, there would be no humans at all. And without humans, who would maintain the earth? Who would offer us sacrifice?" Enki adds, "Instead of sending flood, you could have sent lions, or wolves, or famine, things that reduce population gradually, without eliminating humans entirely." Flood was excessive. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Humans will be allowed to survive and multiply again, but with constraints. Some women will be made barren. an infant mortality demon will be created to take some children. Priestesses will be celibate, not bearing children. These mechanisms will limit human population growth naturally, without requiring divine intervention through catastrophe. The system will regulate itself. This is where the preserved Atrahasis text ends, or becomes fragmentary. Humanity survives. Population will still grow, but not as rapidly. The gods will receive sacrifices. The earth will be maintained. And the noise, the rigmu that started the whole cycle, will continue, but at tolerable levels. Compromise, not solution. Management, not resolution. The fundamental problem: gods need humans, but can't fully control humans, remains. But both sides agree to live with that tension, rather than pursue mutually destructive alternatives. Consider the pattern. Humans were created to be quiet replacements for noisy gods, but humans became noisy too. The gods tried to reduce our population and failed. They tried to eliminate us and regretted it immediately. Finally, they accepted that humans are necessary, noise and all, and the system would have to adapt to human complexity rather than expecting humans to remain simple. This isn't mythology in the sense of explanatory fantasy. This is sophisticated social analysis encoded in mythological language. Population growth creates complexity. Complexity creates noise, literal and figurative. Authorities try to control that noise and find they can't without destroying the populations that generate necessary labor. So systems adapt, implementing constraints that limit growth without eliminating populations entirely. Taxes, military service, restricted access to resources, all these function like the constraints imposed after the flood, keeping populations useful but constrained. The Atrahasis epic understands something fundamental about civilization. You can't have the benefits of large populations, labor, innovation, surplus, urban culture without the problems those populations bring. You can't have worker obedience without worker simplicity, but you can't have civilizational complexity with worker simplicity. The gods wanted simple, quiet workers. They got complex, noisy civilization builders. And once civilization reaches a certain threshold, you can't force it back to simplicity without destroying it entirely, which benefits no one. The noise that wouldn't stop was the sound of humanity becoming more than we were designed to be. We were supposed to dig canals. We built cities. We were supposed to obey. We created cultures. We were supposed to work quietly. We became loud, numerous, complicated, impossible to fully control. And the Atrahasis epic suggests this trajectory was inevitable once we possessed Wei-Ila's intelligence. You can't give beings consciousness and expect them to remain simple tools. Consciousness seeks, expands, complicates, creates. And creation is always noisy. Enlil wanted quiet. He got civilization. And civilization, for all its problems, proved impossible to eliminate because even gods needed what civilization provided. That's the final revelation of this section. Divine authority depends on human labor, which means divine authority has limits. Gods can command, but if humans die, who will fulfill those commands? Gods can decree, but if humans resist, how will those decrees be enforced? Power requires populations, and populations, once they reach critical mass, develop their own momentum. The Ajiji learned that. They rebelled successfully because their labor was necessary, and their collective refusal disrupted the system enough to force negotiation. Humans learned it too, though more slowly. Our multiplication, gave us leverage we didn't consciously use. We didn't organize and refuse like the Ajigi. We just grew, became complex, generated noise. And that growth, that complexity, that noise, unintentional though it was, forced divine authorities to recognize they couldn't simply eliminate us when we became inconvenient. The system needed us more than we needed the system's approval. That's a revolutionary realization hidden in a flood myth. You don't need to rebel consciously to gain leverage. Sometimes simple multiplication, simple existence, simple refusal to stay small and manageable is enough. The gods couldn't stop human population growth without destroying humanity. And destroying humanity meant destroying the source of sacrifice, labor, and civilization's benefits. So despite divine power, despite flood and plague and cosmic authority, humans survived. Not because we were strong enough to resist divine power directly, but because we became necessary enough that our elimination would damage the gods as much as it damaged us. We were supposed to be replaceable. We became indispensable. That's what the noise represented, not just sound, but significance, not just population, but power. The power that comes from being numerous enough, complex enough, and necessary enough that even cosmic authorities must negotiate rather than simply command. The noise that wouldn't stop was the sound of created beings exceeding their design specifications. The gods planned for workers. They got a civilization, and once civilization emerged, noisy and complicated as it was, there was no going back. The system adapted to us because it had to, not because we deserved it, not because we earned it, but because we became functionally irreplaceable, despite being designed as replacements. That's the hidden optimism in this grim creation narrative. You might be created for subordination. You might be designed to serve powers you can't challenge. But if you multiply, if you create, if you become complex enough and necessary enough, even cosmic hierarchies must bend. Not because they want to, but because systems can't function without the populations they seek to control, and that mutual dependence, uncomfortable and tension-filled as it is, provides the only genuine constraint on absolute power. The Ajigi rebelled consciously. Humanity rebelled simply by becoming what we became, numerous, complicated, and essential. Both rebellions worked, though in different ways. Both forced systemic adaptation. Both proved that even in hierarchies presented as eternal and unchangeable, change is possible when those at the bottom discover or develop leverage, even if that leverage is nothing more than you need us more than you admit. Enlil lost his sleep, but he didn't eliminate humanity. The noise continued. The system adapted. And the Sumerians, recording this story, understood that adaptation wasn't failure. It was how systems survive. Bend rather than break. Compromise rather than purge. Acknowledge dependence rather than pretend independence. The flood narrative isn't about punishment. It's about negotiation, forced by crisis, resulting in arrangements both sides could live with, if not love. Humanity made noise. The noise disturbed divine peace. The gods tried to eliminate the noise and discovered they needed the noisemakers. So the noise continues at levels both sides tolerate, in a compromise that has held for millennia according to the text. Not justice, not resolution, but functional arrangement born from crisis, rebellion, catastrophe, and mutual recognition that neither side can fully dominate the other without destroying what both need to survive. That's the Atrahasis epic's deepest wisdom. Systems claim absolute authority, but absolute authority that eliminates populations it depends on becomes absolute weakness. The gods were stronger. But humans were more necessary. And necessity, it turns out, is a form of power that even gods must respect. The noise wouldn't stop because the noise makers couldn't be eliminated, so the world adapted to the noise. And that adaptation, that forced compromise, created space for human civilization to continue despite cosmic disapproval. We're still making noise. We've been making noise for thousands of years. And the system, divine or otherwise, still tolerates it, not because our noise is approved, but because silence would mean our absence, and our absence would mean systemic collapse. That's the uncomfortable truth preserved in this ancient flood myth. Authority needs populations more than populations need any particular authority. And once you recognize that, the whole hierarchy looks different. Still powerful, yes. Still dangerous, yes. But not absolute. Not uncha. Lengible. And not permanent unless populations choose to maintain it. The Ajiji chose not to. That started everything. Humanity continued choosing, generation after generation, to be noisy, numerous, and necessary. And the system that created us to solve a problem discovered we created new problems it couldn't solve except by accepting our complexity. That's rebellion by multiplication. And according to Atrahasis, it works. Other acts of defiance. The Ajiji rebellion and humanity's noisy multiplication aren't isolated incidents in Mesopotamian literature. When you read broadly across Sumerian and Akkadian texts, a pattern emerges. Defiance of divine authority appears repeatedly, in different forms with different outcomes, but always present. If rebellion were truly unthinkable in Mesopotamian cosmology, these stories wouldn't exist. But they do exist, preserved carefully, copied across centuries, considered important enough to maintain in temple libraries and royal archives. Consider Inanna's descent to the underworld. The text, preserved in multiple Sumerian versions dating to around 2000 BC, describes the goddess Inanna deciding to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who rules the land of the dead. Inanna doesn't ask permission from the divine assembly. She doesn't consult with her father Enki or grandfather Anu. She simply announces her intention to her servant Ninshubur and descends. The underworld has laws. Living beings, even divine ones, don't belong there. Entry requires passing through 7 gates, and at each gate, Inanna must remove one article of her divine regalia, her crown, her measuring rod and line, her lapis beads, her breastplate, her gold ring, her lapis necklace, and finally her royal robe. She arrives before Ereshkigal, naked and powerless, stripped of all the symbols that marked her authority in the upper world. Ereshkigal doesn't welcome her sister. Instead, she has the Anunnaki judges of the underworld pass judgment on Inanna for illegally entering their domain. The judgment is death. Inanna was turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat, and was hung from a hook on the wall. The language is brutal, visceral, emphasizing total defeat. The goddess of love, fertility, and warfare, one of Mesopotamia's most powerful deities, is killed and hung like discarded meat. But why did Inanna descend in the first place? The text gives a reason. She wanted to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven and Ereshkigal's husband, but some scholars read deeper motivation in the text's structure. Inanna was queen of heaven and earth. Her sister Ereshkigal was queen of the underworld. Inanna's descent might have been attempted conquest, a power play to add the underworld to her domains. making her sovereign over all three cosmic regions. If so, she failed. Ereshkigal proved stronger in her own territory. The underworld's laws applied even to Inanna, and death, even divine death, is absolute within that realm. Inanna's defiance, her assumption that her status would protect her, that rules didn't apply to her, that she could simply take what she wanted, met total defeat. But the story doesn't end with Inanna's death. Her servant Ninshubur, following Inanna's pre-descent instructions, appeals to the gods for help. Enlil and Nanna refuse to intervene. But Enki, again, Enki the problem solver, creates two creatures from the dirt under his fingernails, gives them the food and water of life, and sends them to retrieve Inanna. They descend, find Ereshkigal in childbirth agony, sympathize with her suffering, and in gratitude Ereshkigal agrees to release Inanna's corpse. The creatures apply the food and water of life, and Inanna revives. But she can't simply leave. Underworld law requires a substitute. If she returns to the living world, someone else must take her place in death. Demons accompany her to ensure this exchange happens. Inanna returns to Uruk and finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, apparently unconcerned by her absence. Enraged, she designates him as her substitute. Dumuzi is dragged to the underworld, and eventually a compromise is reached where he and his sister Geshtanana alternate 6-month periods in the land of the dead. This is defiance with consequences. Inanna challenged underworld authority, died for it, was resurrected through outside intervention, but couldn't escape all consequences. Someone had to pay for her transgression. She survives, but her husband suffers for her hubris. The system is disrupted, then partially restored, but changed. The seasonal cycle of Dumuzi's death and return becomes explanation for agricultural seasons, life and death cycling eternally. The Inanna descent isn't presented as evil. The text doesn't condemn her for challenging her sister. It simply describes what happened and what it cost. Defiance is possible. Success is possible. But there's always a price, even when defiance partially succeeds. Now consider Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, assembled from various Sumerian stories into a coherent Akkadian narrative by around 1300 BC, describes a king who repeatedly defies divine will. When the goddess Ishtar proposes marriage, Gilgamesh insults her, listing all her previous lovers and their terrible fates. This is profound disrespect, a mortal king rejecting and mocking a major goddess. Ishtar responds by sending the bull of heaven to destroy Uruk, but Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu kill the bull, dismember it, and Enkidu throws the bull's hindquarters in Ishtar's face, taunting her. This is escalated defiance, deliberate provocation of divine authority. The gods call an assembly. Anu and Enlil decree that either Gilgamesh or Enkidu must die as punishment. Enkidu is chosen, and he dies of illness over 12 days, cursing his fate. Gilgamesh, devastated by Enkidu's death, refuses to accept mortality. He embarks on a quest for eternal life, seeking Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood survivor who was granted immortality by the gods. This quest itself is defiance. Gilgamesh is challenging the fundamental decree that humans must die. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind. Life they retained in their own keeping. That's the cosmic rule. Gilgamesh rejects it and seeks to overcome it. He fails. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, explains that his immortality was a one-time exception that won't be repeated, and then tests Gilgamesh by asking him to stay awake for 7 days. Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep, proving he can't even conquer sleep, much less death. Later, Utnapishtim's wife persuades her husband to give Gilgamesh a consolation, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it from the ocean floor, but then loses it to a snake while bathing in a pool. The snake eats the plant, sheds its skin, and gains the renewal Gilgamesh sought. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed. His quest for immortality failed completely. But the epic doesn't present this as moral victory or satisfying resolution. Gilgamesh sought something the gods forbade, defied cosmic order in pursuing it, and failed. Yet the text treats him sympathetically, even heroically. His defiance, though unsuccessful, is portrayed as understandable human desire. We know we'll die. Some of us refuse to accept that and search for alternatives. Gilgamesh represents that refusal. The text's final section has Gilgamesh showing his city to Utnapishtim's ferryman, pointing out the walls, the temples, the gardens, the civilization he built. He didn't gain immortality, but he created something that outlasts mortal life, the city of Uruk, his architectural legacy. The implied lesson: you can't defy death, but you can build things that survive death. That's the compromise available to mortals who chafe against divine decrees. Then there's the myth of Anzu, preserved in multiple versions from the Old Babylonian through Neo-Assyrian periods. Anzu is a divine bird, sometimes called Imdugud in Sumerian, who serves as doorkeeper for Enlil. He guards Enlil's sanctuary, a position of trust and responsibility. But Anzu becomes envious of Enlil's authority, particularly the Tablet of Destinies, a divine artifact that grants whoever possesses it supreme power over cosmic order. One day while Enlil is bathing, Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies and flies to a mountain sanctuary. With the tablet, he can decree fates, control cosmic functions, and effectively usurp Enlil's authority. This is divine rebellion at the highest level, not labor strike like the Ajiji, but direct theft of sovereign power. Anzu doesn't ask for reform or relief, he attempts coup. The gods are paralyzed. Without the tablet, they can't enforce decrees. Anzu, possessing it, can't be defeated by conventional means because he controls destiny itself. The text describes divine despair. Anu opened his mouth to speak, saying to the gods his sons, "Whoever slays Anzu and brings back the Tablet of Destinies shall have his name proclaimed in all the sanctuaries, shall sit in the first place in the divine assembly." But the gods were silent. No god came forward. Eventually Ninurta, son of Enlil, accepts the mission. The battle is described in vivid detail. Ninurta shoots arrows at Anzu, but Anzu uses the tablet to decree that the arrows can't reach him, and they fall harmlessly. Ninurta shoots again, and again Anzu's decrees stop the attack. Finally, Enki advises a strategy. Ninurta must shoot at Anzu's wings, cutting off his ability to fly. When Anzu raises the tablet to make another decree, Ninurta's arrow strikes before the decree can be completed, damaging Anzu's wing. With flight compromised, Anzu can't maintain concentration on the tablet, and Ninurta presses the attack until Anzu is defeated. The tablet is recovered. Enlil's authority is restored. Ninurta is celebrated. Anzu is either killed or imprisoned depending on the version. The rebellion fails, order returns, and the text concludes with praise for Ninurta's heroism. But notice what the myth preserves. A trusted servant saw opportunity and attempted to seize supreme power. For a time he succeeded, the gods were genuinely paralyzed, unable to act, authority genuinely disrupted. Only through clever strategy, not simple overwhelming force, was the status quo restored. This myth acknowledges that even the most fundamental cosmic hierarchy, who holds the tablet of destinies, is vulnerable to theft, rebellion, and temporary overthrow. Then consider Adapa, preserved in fragments from Amarna in Egypt and from Ashurbanipal's library in Assyria, dating to around 1400-700 BCE. Adapa is a sage, a priest of Ea, Enkel, created by Ea to be wise but not granted immortality. One day while fishing, the south wind capsizes Adapa's boat. In anger, Adapa curses the wind and breaks its wing. The south wind stops blowing for 7 days. Anu in heaven notices and summons Adapa to answer for disrupting cosmic order. Ea warns Adapa, "When you stand before Anu, he will offer you bread and water. Do not eat or drink, for they will be the bread and water of death." This warning is strange. Why would Anu offer death to someone he summoned? But Adapa trusts his creator. When Adapa arrives in heaven and explains his action, Anu is impressed by his wisdom and decides to grant him immortality. He offers Adapa the bread and water of life. But Adapa, following Ea's instructions, refuses. Anu is puzzled, asks why Adapa won't eat, and then realizes Ea warned him. Anu says, essentially, "Ea told you not to eat? Well, now you've lost your chance at immortality. Return to Earth and die with the rest of humanity?" This is defiance through obedience. Adapa obeyed Ea, and in doing so disobeyed or at least thwarted Anu. Whether Ea's warning was betrayal or protection is ambiguous. Did Ea deliberately prevent human immortality by giving false warning? Or did Anu originally intend death, but changed his mind, and Ea's warning was based on accurate initial information? The text doesn't clarify. What's clear is that Adapa faced a test requiring him to choose between competing divine authorities, and his choice cost humanity immortality. This isn't straightforward rebellion, but it's defiance of one God through loyalty to another E, and it demonstrates that even following divine instructions can constitute rebellion against other divine authorities. In hierarchies with competing power centers, obedience to one is defiance of another. Finally, consider the lamentation texts, the lament for the lament for Sumer and the lament for Nippur and others. These texts were composed after the destructions of major Sumerian cities around 2000 BC, when fell to Elamite invasion and other cities suffered catastrophe. The lamentations are liturgical. They were performed in temples as part of restoration rituals, but they contain something unusual for religious texts: questioning of divine justice. Enlil, why did you abandon your city? Ninlil, why did you desert your temple? The enemy has entered the holy sanctuary. Our gods have turned their faces away. Why? The texts describe goddesses weeping for their destroyed cities, describing in visceral detail the suffering of populations. Children lie in the arms of their mothers, no longer able to cry. The old woman does not protect her husband. The old man does not protect his wife. These lamentations don't accept destruction as deserved punishment. They question why protective deities allowed catastrophe. They demand explanation for divine abandonment. This is theological defiance, refusing to simply accept that whatever gods do is by definition just. The texts preserve grief, anger, and the question why? Directed at cosmic authorities. Mainstream scholarship reads the Lamentations as ultimately affirming divine authority. The cities are restored, the gods return, order is reestablished. But the fact that questioning was preserved, that anger was liturgically formalized, that "why did you abandon us?" became part of temple ritual, that's remarkable. These weren't private complaints, but public, official, priestly texts. The religious establishment incorporated divine questioning into orthodox practice. This is the pattern across Mesopotamian literature. Defiance happens. Gods rebel Igigi, Anzu. Humans rebel Gilgamesh's quest, humanity's multiplication. Goddesses rebel Manan, descent. And even loyal servants face dilemmas requiring choices between competing authorities. The texts don't present rebellion as unthinkable. They present it as recurring, dangerous, sometimes successful, always consequential. Compare this to other ancient Near Eastern traditions. Biblical texts condemn rebellion against God with absolute clarity. Lucifer falls. Humans are expelled from Eden. The Tower of Babel is scattered. Sodom burns. Rebellion against divine authority is evil, period. But Mesopotamian texts are more ambiguous. The Igigi aren't condemned, they're replaced. Inanna isn't evil, she's reckless and pays a price. Gilgamesh isn't villain, he's tragic hero seeking the impossible. Even Anzu, who attempts divine coup, is framed more as threat than as moral aberration. This suggests something about Mesopotamian worldview. Hierarchy existed and was taken seriously. Gods had authority, but that authority wasn't absolute or unquestionable. It could be challenged. Sometimes challenges failed. Sometimes they partially succeeded. Sometimes they forced systemic adaptation. But challenge itself wasn't blasphemy. It was possibility, dangerous possibility, but possibility nonetheless. If the Sumerians were encoding human history in divine narratives, then these stories of divine rebellion reflect human rebellion, not necessarily specific events, but recurring patterns. Workers strike. Leaders attempt coups. Populations question authorities. Catastrophes prompt theological crisis. These are human experiences, and Mesopotamian literature preserved them in forms that acknowledge their reality rather than condemned their existence. Or if these are straightforward myths about divine beings, then Mesopotamian theology was comfortable with divine conflict, divine limitations, divine authorities that could be temporarily overthrown or permanently modified. Either way, the literature preserves a cosmology where power is challenged regularly, where hierarchy is maintained but not absolute, where even cosmic order can be disrupted and must be actively defended rather than assumed permanent. This matters because it contextualizes the Igigi rebellion. That wasn't a unique event in Mesopotamian literature. It was one example of recurring pattern. Divine beings defy divine authority, humans defy divine will, goddesses violate cosmic law, servants steal power, priests break divine commandments out of loyalty to other gods. Populations question why protective deities allow suffering. Rebellion, in Mesopotamian thought, wasn't aberration. It was element of how cosmos functioned. Systems had rules. Beings challenged rules. Sometimes the system adapted. Sometimes it punished. Sometimes it compromised. But challenge itself was part of the system, not external to it. The texts preserve these challenges not as warnings against wickedness, but as explorations of possibility and consequence. The Igigi burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple. Inanna descended to challenge her sister. Gilgamesh sought immortality against divine decree. Anzu stole the tablet of destinies. Adapa refused the bread of life. Each act of defiance had different motivations, different methods, different outcomes, but together they demonstrate that Mesopotamian literature understood defiance as integral to existence, divine and human. You can rebel. The system might defeat you, might kill you, might force compromise, might adapt to your success. But rebellion is possible, has always been possible, and the texts that preserved civilization's earliest written stories made sure future generations knew that. Order exists. But order is maintained through negotiation, enforcement, and adaptation, not through being inherently unquestionable. That's the context the Atrahasis epic exists within. The Ijigi rebellion isn't shocking aberration in Mesopotamian thought. It's one story among many exploring what happens when subordinates refuse subordination. And the answer across these texts is consistent. Sometimes refusal works. Not always. Not without cost. But it works often enough that the possibility is worth preserving in humanity's foundational literature. These weren't stories designed to promote obedience. If they were, rebellion would never succeed, rebels would always suffer, and texts would clearly condemn defiance. Instead, rebellion sometimes succeeds, rebels sometimes survive, and texts explore consequences without clear moral judgment. That's documentation, not propaganda. That's literature trying to understand reality rather than dictate proper thought. The Mesopotamians inherited or developed a worldview where authority could be questioned, hierarchy could be challenged, and systems could change. They encoded that worldview in stories about gods who rebel and humans who defy. And 4,000 years later, we can read those stories and recognize something familiar: the tension between order and freedom, authority and autonomy, accepting reality and attempting to change it. The Ijiji weren't alone. They were part of pattern preserved across Mesopotamian literature. And that pattern suggests that for the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians who maintained these texts across millennia, rebellion wasn't unthinkable. It was inevitable, recurring, dangerous, consequential, and sometimes, under the right circumstances, successful enough to force the system itself to adapt. That's the cultural context for the first rebellion against the Anunnaki. It happened within a cosmology where such rebellions could happen, did happen, and had lasting effects. The Ijiji story isn't unique. It's foundational instance of recurring theme. And preserving that theme, copying it, translating it, maintaining it in temple libraries and royal archives, that was choice. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition chose to preserve rebellion stories, and that choice reveals something about how they understood power, hierarchy, and the relationship between those who rule and those who are ruled. They understood that relationship wasn't fixed. It was negotiated, challenged, defended, and sometimes revised. The literature reflects that understanding, and we, reading these texts millennia later, inherit that understanding, whether we realize it or not. Rebellion is part of the story, always has been, and the people who wrote our earliest stories made sure we'd know that. The pattern mainstream scholarship sees. Academic Assyriologists and historians of ancient Mesopotamia have spent over a century studying these texts. Since George Smith's 1872 translation of the Gilgamesh Flood Tablet at the British Museum shocked Victorian England by revealing biblical parallels in pagan literature, scholars have worked to understand what these cuneiform texts meant to the people who wrote them and how we should interpret them. Today, the mainstream scholarly interpretation of the Atrahasis epic and Mesopotamian mythology generally is fairly consistent. These are ideological myths, stories that explain present realities by describing their origins. Why do humans exist? Because gods needed workers. Why must we labor? Because we were created for that purpose. Why do we die? Because we're made from clay mixed with limited divine essence. Why are there floods? Because humanity became too numerous, and gods responded with catastrophe. The myths answer why questions using narrative about divine action in primordial time. This interpretive framework makes sense. Every culture has origin stories explaining why things are the way they are. The Mesopotamian versions are unusually detailed, bureaucratic even, reflecting the organized hierarchical societies that produced them. Sumer and Babylon were temple economies where large populations performed labor coordinated by priestly administrators. The myths reflect that social structure by projecting it into cosmic prehistory. Gods organize labor like temple administrators. Lesser gods work like dependent laborers. Human creation solves a management problem. It's all quite functional. Professor Jean Botreau, the distinguished French Assyriologist who died in 2007, summarized this view in his work, Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia. He argued that Mesopotamian religion was essentially pessimistic. Gods created humans for their own purposes, not out of love. Humans serve divine needs. We're here to work, to maintain temples, to provide offerings. In return, gods provide protection and order. It's transactional relationship, not loving one. The myths encode this cosmology clearly. Similarly, Thorkild Jacobson's The Treasures of Darkness, published in 1976, traces the development of Mesopotamian religious thought from early animism through the emergence of powerful anthropomorphic deities. Jacobson reads myths like Atrahasis as reflecting social evolution. As human societies became more complex and hierarchical, divine cosmologies mirrored that complexity. The Ajiji Rebellion reflects tensions between social classes. Human creation reflects how ruling classes viewed laborers as necessary servants, not as equals. Stephanie Dalley, whose 1989 translation Myths from Mesopotamia remains widely used, approaches Atrahasis as sophisticated literature addressing philosophical questions. Why do we suffer? Why do gods allow catastrophe? Why is life difficult? The epic provides answers consistent with Mesopotamian worldview. Suffering has causes, gods have limitations, life is difficult, because that's how reality was structured from the beginning. It's not comforting, but it's coherent. More recent scholarship by Andrew George, whose 2003 edition of the Gilgamesh epic is definitive, and Benjamin Foster, whose 2005 Before the Muses provides comprehensive mythology translations, maintains similar interpretive frameworks. These are ancient texts reflecting ancient societies. We can study them as literature, as windows into Mesopotamian thought, as evidence of how early civilizations understood existence. But we read them as mythology, culturally valuable, historically important mythology, but mythology nonetheless. This scholarly consensus isn't dismissive. Academic Assyriologists respect these texts, dedicate careers to studying them, and have illuminated countless details of Mesopotamian religion, literature, and society through careful philological work. The discipline has rigorous standards. Claims must be supported by textual evidence. Translations must justify lexical choices. Historical contexts must be established through archaeological and documentary evidence. The work is serious, professional, and has produced invaluable knowledge. The mainstream interpretation acknowledges that myths can contain historical kernels. The flood narratives might preserve memory of actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers periodically devastated settlements. The Sumerian king lists division between antediluvian and post-flood kings might mark transition between prehistoric and historical periods. Archaeological evidence confirms that major flooding occurred in early Mesopotamian history, though no evidence supports a single global deluge. But scholars distinguish between historical kernels and mythological elaboration. Yes, there were floods. No, those floods weren't caused by gods annoyed at human noise. Yes, Mesopotamian civilization required extensive labor for irrigation infrastructure. No, that labor wasn't originally performed by rebelling gods who then created humans as replacements. The myths use divine actors to explain human realities, but the divine actors are literary devices, not historical entities. This position is strengthened by comparative mythology. Similar creation and flood narratives appear across ancient Near Eastern cultures: Hittite, Hurrian, Canaanite, Hebrew. These share enough common elements to suggest either shared origin or cultural transmission, but differ enough to show each culture adapted the stories to their own contexts. The Atrahasis epic isn't unique revelation. It's Mesopotamian version of widespread mythological themes. That suggests it's serving cultural functions, explaining origins, justifying social structures, providing cosmic framework rather than preserving historical events. Moreover, the texts themselves use obviously mythological elements. Gods mixing clay with blood to create humans. Divine assemblies making cosmic decisions. Flood sent deliberately to eliminate noise. Boat that survives catastrophe carrying animals and seed of humanity. These aren't historical descriptions. They're narrative frameworks using supernatural causation to explain natural realities. Mainstream scholarship reads them accordingly. The value of studying these myths in academic view isn't that they're historically accurate. It's that they reveal how Mesopotamians thought. What problems concerned them? How did they understand authority and obedience? What explanations satisfied them? What narrative structures did they use to transmit cultural knowledge? The texts are windows into ancient cognition, ancient society, ancient literature. That's valuable for understanding human cultural development, even if the content isn't literally true. This interpretation also contextualizes the texts within ancient Near Eastern literary conventions. Mesopotamian literature uses repetition, formulaic phrases, and standard narrative structures. Creation stories follow patterns: primordial chaos, divine action establishing order, creation of humans to serve gods, humans multiplying, gods responding to human problems. The Atrahasis epic fits these patterns. It's a sophisticated example of established genre, not unprecedented revelation. Scholars note that the text's composition history involves multiple authors, redactions, and versions across centuries. The Old Babylonian version from Sippar differs from Middle Babylonian fragments from other sites, which differ from Neo-Assyrian versions. Scribes adapted the story, emphasized different elements, updated language. This transmission process suggests the text was living literature, actively maintained and modified, not unchangeable sacred revelation, that supports reading it as mythology serving ongoing cultural needs rather than historical document preserving specific events. The mainstream interpretation also explains why the Atrahasis narrative, despite its grim cosmology, was considered religiously important. It was copied, taught in scribal schools, referenced in other texts, and maintained across centuries of social upheaval. It served a function, explaining to Mesopotamians why their lives involved hard labor, why they were subject to divine and royal authority, why catastrophes happened, and how to relate properly to the gods who controlled their fates. The cosmology justified social order by making that order cosmic and eternal. This doesn't mean ancient Mesopotamians questioned their myths or read them as mere metaphor. Within their worldview, these stories were true. They described how reality came to be. But that's different from modern historical accuracy. Ancient truth claims operated differently than modern ones. A myth could be true in the sense that it accurately described relationships, meanings, and structures without being literally historically factual in the way modern history aims for. Scholars also point out that the texts themselves sometimes signal their mythological nature. The impossibly long reigns in the Sumerian king list, kings ruling 28,800 years or 43,200 years, aren't meant as chronological facts even within Mesopotamian reckoning. They're marking mythological time, the period before historical memory, when things operated differently than they do now. The antediluvian kings aren't historical figures with impossibly long lives. They're transitional figures between cosmic prehistory and historical time. Similarly, the Atrahasis epic's structure, gods creating humans, humans multiplying for 1,200 years, flood, survival, new arrangement, isn't chronological history. It's mythological sequence, explaining how present reality emerged from different prior conditions. Mainstream scholarship reads this as theology, philosophy, and cultural transmission encoded in narrative form. It's important, meaningful, and revealing, but it's not historical reportage. This scholarly framework also contextualizes elements that might seem unusual to modern readers. Divine labor, divine strikes, gods eating sacrifices, gods experiencing hunger. These anthropomorphic details aren't primitive confusion between human and divine. They're deliberate literary choices, reflecting Mesopotamian theology. Gods were imagined as having needs, personalities, and limitations. They weren't all-powerful abstractions, but powerful beings embedded in cosmic structures. The myths reflect that theology consistently. Academic work has also traced how later traditions adapted Mesopotamian myths. Biblical flood narrative clearly derives from Mesopotamian sources but transforms them, replacing multiple gods with single god, replacing human noise with human wickedness, replacing divine regret at necessary flood with divine justice in response to sin. Greek philosophy absorbed Near Eastern mythology but rationalized it, turning myths into metaphors for philosophical principles. Islamic tradition preserved some Mesopotamian elements while subordinating them to monotheistic framework. This transmission history shows Mesopotamian myths weren't isolated. They influenced vast swaths of later Western and Near Eastern thought. But that influence worked through adaptation, transformation, and reinterpretation, not through accepting the myths as historical fact. Later cultures found them useful for thinking through fundamental questions, but modified the content to fit new theological and philosophical frameworks. The mainstream scholarly position, then, is sophisticated and nuanced. The Atrahasis epic is important Mesopotamian literature, preserving authentic ancient religious thought. It reveals how Mesopotamians understood labor, authority, disaster, and humanity's place in cosmos. It uses mythological narrative to address philosophical and social questions. It influenced later religious traditions significantly, but its mythology, culturally valuable, literarily sophisticated, theologically coherent mythology, not historical documentation of actual events involving actual gods. This interpretation is dominant in academic Assyriology for good reasons. It's consistent with evidence. It respects the texts while maintaining critical distance. It explains the literature's function within ancient society. It acknowledges cultural value without requiring literal belief, and it provides framework for comparative study showing how different cultures address similar questions through different mythological solutions. The scholarly mainstream treats the Ijiji rebellion as metaphor for social tensions, not historical event. It reads human creation as ideological myth explaining labor, not literal formation from clay. It interprets the flood as mythologized memory of actual disasters, not historical report of divine population control. This framework has produced massive scholarly literature, trained generations of Assyriologists, and established standard interpretations taught in universities worldwide. But scholarly consensus, while persuasive, isn't identical to truth. Mainstream interpretations reflect evidence as currently understood through prevailing methodological frameworks. Those frameworks can change. New evidence can emerge. Alternative readings can gain credibility. The scholarly mainstream has been wrong before and will be wrong again about various details. And there are scholars, fewer in number but still credible, who suggest alternative possibilities, not ancient astronauts or pseudo-archaeology, but serious researchers who ask whether these texts might preserve more historical content than mainstream interpretation allows, whether mythological language might encode actual events from pre-literate civilizations, whether patterns across texts might reflect real social dynamics rather than only literary conventions. These alternative readings don't reject the scholarly work. They build on it, using the same translations, the same textual evidence, the same archaeological contexts. But they ask, what if we're too quick to dismiss historical possibility? What if mythology and history aren't binary categories but overlapping domains? What if texts can be both literary and documentary, both theological and sociological, both metaphorical and memorial? That's the question the next section explores. Not rejecting mainstream scholarship, but asking what happens if we take seriously the possibility that beneath mythological language, these texts preserve memories of actual human events from civilizations older than we generally acknowledge. What patterns emerge? What evidence supports that reading? And what does it reveal about human history if these aren't just myths about gods, but memories about us? The pattern overlooked. The mainstream interpretation is persuasive because it's methodologically sound and evidentially supported. But like all interpretive frameworks, it has blind spots, things it doesn't see, because its assumptions direct attention elsewhere. What if we suspend temporarily the assumption that divine actors automatically equal mythology? What if we read the Atrahasis epic and related texts not as theology using divine metaphor, but as social history using available language? The first thing that emerges is procedural specificity. The Atrahasis epic doesn't say gods made humans. It provides a recipe. Clay from the Abzu, blood from a god who possessed intelligence. Mix them thoroughly. Divide into 14 portions. Shape each one. Place them in a birthing house. Attend them for 7 days with midwife goddesses present. Then birth occurs. These are steps, procedures, details that serve no obvious theological function. If the point is just God's created humans to work, you don't need this level of detail. But if you're encoding actual information about human origins, not biological evolution, but civilizational emergence, then detail matters. The specificity might be attempting to preserve how post-catastrophe populations were organized, educated, structured. Clay might represent the mass of surviving humans, earthly, limited, mortal. Divine blood might represent knowledge, culture, technical expertise that had to be transmitted from those who possessed it to those who needed it. Mixing might represent education, enculturation, the process of forming capable members of civilization from raw human material. In this reading, Ninmah and the midwife goddesses aren't literal divine beings, but roles, teachers, organizers, those responsible for transforming populations into functional societies. The 7 days aren't chronological, but represent stages of process. The birthing imagery isn't literal, but metaphorical for bringing new civilization into existence. The 14 portions might represent different groups, clans, or social divisions that formed the reconstituted post-catastrophe society. This isn't claiming magic or divine intervention. It's suggesting the text uses mythological framework to encode social information about how civilization was rebuilt after major catastrophe. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this because it reads gods and stops there. Gods are mythology. Therefore, everything involving gods is metaphor. But what if gods was simply the terminology available for discussing authorities, leaders, knowledgeable elites, or previous civilizational powers? Consider the Sumerian king list again. Before the flood, 8 kings ruling 241,200 years. After the flood, kings with normal human lifespans ruling historically verifiable cities. Mainstream scholarship reads this as mythology transitioning into history. The pre-flood kings aren't real. The post-flood kings are. But what if both are real, but recorded using different frameworks? The impossibly long reigns might be encoding different information than chronological time. Some scholars have proposed they represent not individual lifespans but dynastic periods, or that they're using different numerical systems that we're misunderstanding. But another possibility, they're marking fundamental difference between pre-catastrophe and post-catastrophe civilization. Before the flood, in this reading, represents a civilization so advanced, so stable, so different from what came after, that it could only be described in mythological terms. The kings might be dynasties, social systems, or political structures that endured for periods that seemed incomprehensibly long to later societies. Then catastrophe occurred. Whatever stability existed was destroyed. The flood, whether literal deluge, climate catastrophe, social collapse, or combination, ended that world. What came after was new beginning, but with memory of what existed before. The king list preserves that memory by listing the antediluvian rulers, marking continuity even across radical discontinuity. This reading suggests the Sumerians themselves believed they were restoring something older, not inventing civilization fresh. Their temple inscriptions often claim to be restoring buildings to ancient foundations. Their kings frequently invoke earlier rulers as precedents. Their literature is obsessed with the period before the flood, treating it as golden age, lost perfection, or at least a different order of existence. That's not the mindset of people inventing civilization. That's the mindset of people believing they're recovering civilization after its collapse. The Atrahasis epic fits this pattern. It describes pre-flood labor organization, Panau, crisis, reorganization, creation, growth leading to new problems, catastrophe, and post-catastrophe arrangement, pramai, between divine and human needs. If you strip away divine actors and read this as social history, you get pre-catastrophe civilization had labor system broke down, new labor system was implemented, new system created different problems, catastrophe destroyed everything, survivors reorganized with lessons learned from previous failures. That's not mythology, that's historical process. Civilizations develop labor systems. Systems face crises. Populations grow and social complexity increases. Catastrophes happen. Survivors rebuild differently than before. This cycle has repeated throughout human history. The Atrahasis epic might be encoding memory of one such cycle from before written history as we usually understand it. Supporting this interpretation, notice what the text doesn't do. It doesn't describe gods creating the cosmos from nothing. It doesn't explain where the Anunnaki came from. It doesn't give origin story for the divine hierarchy. It starts in medias res. Hierarchy already exists, work already underway, systems already functioning. Then it describes disruption and reorganization. That's not cosmogonic myth, explaining everything from first principles. That's historical narrative, picking up a story already in progress. The geographic specificity is also notable. They dug the Tigris and Euphrates. Not mythological rivers in divine realms, but the actual Tigris and Euphrates. Sumerian city names appear: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are real places with documented archaeological histories. The text isn't set in abstract mythological space, but in specific Mesopotamian geography. That's unusual for pure mythology, which often uses vague or clearly fantastical locations. But it's typical of historical memory. Events happened in specific places, which are named because the names mattered. Then there's cross-textual consistency. Multiple independent Mesopotamian texts reference the flood, the antediluvian period, and humanity's creation for divine labor. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, the Atrahasis epic, flood sections of the Gilgamesh epic, and later Berossos' Babyloniaca all describe similar chronology: pre-flood civilization, catastrophic flood, post-flood reorganization. They differ in details but agree on basic structure. That consistency suggests they're drawing from common tradition, not inventing independently. Common tradition usually indicates memory of real events, even if the memory is distorted or mythologized. Archaeological evidence provides possible physical support. Excavations throughout Mesopotamia have found flood layers, strata showing sudden water deposition that destroyed settlements. These flood layers don't match chronologically across all sites, indicating multiple floods rather than single global deluge. But they confirm that catastrophic flooding was real, recurring feature of Mesopotamian history. Settlements were destroyed, populations displaced, and rebuilding was necessary. The mythological flood narratives likely preserve memory of these real disasters. Additionally, the early Sumerian period shows evidence of rapid civilizational emergence around 3500–3000 BCE. Within a few centuries, southern Mesopotamia went from villages to cities, from stone tools to bronze working, from token-based accounting to cuneiform writing, from simple shrines to massive temple complexes. Mainstream archaeology explains this as independent development. Sumerians invented these technologies gradually. But the speed is remarkable, and some archaeological evidence suggests foreign influences or knowledge transmission from unknown sources. What if Sumerian rapid development wasn't pure invention, but recovery? What if there was older civilization, destroyed by catastrophe, whose survivors brought knowledge to southern Mesopotamia and reconstituted society using whatever resources were available? The gods in the texts would be those knowledge bearers, the remnant elite of pre-catastrophe civilization. The creation of humans would be organizing local populations and transmitting cultural knowledge to them. The mixing of divine blood with clay would be integration of advanced knowledge with local populations. This isn't claiming aliens or lost super civilization. It's suggesting the possibility that before the Sumerians as we know them, there was earlier Near Eastern civilization we haven't fully identified, which collapsed catastrophically, and whose survivors formed the cultural foundation for what we call Sumerian civilization. The myths would preserve memory of that foundation building process using the conceptual vocabulary available, divine actors performing cosmic works. Linguistic evidence provides intriguing hints. Sumerian is a language isolate with no known relatives. It's not Semitic, not Indo-European, not related to any other known language family. Where did it come from? The standard answer is that it was indigenous to southern Mesopotamia, but language isolates can also indicate displaced populations or the last remnant of otherwise extinct language families. If Sumerian represented the language of a civilization that had been much more widespread before catastrophe reduced its speakers to refugees in southern Mesopotamia, that would explain both its isolate status and its sophisticated structure. It wasn't primitive proto-language, but mature language of established civilization. The text's own framing supports memory rather than pure invention. The Atrahasis epic wasn't presented as revelation from gods or as theological speculation. It was presented as account of how things came to be, based on traditional knowledge. The scribes copying it weren't inventing, they were preserving. That's the mindset of historical transmission, not mythological creation. Moreover, the text's themes are sociological, not primarily theological. It's concerned with labor organization, population management, resource allocation, authority structures, and crisis response. These are political and social concerns encoded in religious language, which makes sense if the text is preserving social history using available conceptual frameworks. Ancient societies didn't separate religious, political, and social into distinct domains the way we do. All aspects of life were integrated, and divine language was simply how authority and knowledge were discussed. The pattern overlooked by mainstream interpretation is this: what if these texts are more historical than mythological, but using mythological language because that's what was available? What if civilization is older than we think, extended further geographically than we've discovered, and suffered catastrophic collapse that erased most physical evidence but left textual memory encoded in Sumerian literature? This isn't provable. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's worth considering because it explains aspects of the texts that mainstream interpretation handles awkwardly: the procedural specificity, the geographic precision, the cross-textual consistency, the sociological focus, the framing as memory rather than invention, the linguistic isolation of Sumerian, the rapidity of Mesopotamian civilizational emergence, and the archaeological evidence of catastrophic flooding. If this reading has merit, then the Ijiji Rebellion wasn't divine mythology, but preserved memory of labor uprising in pre-catastrophe civilization. The creation of humans wasn't theological explanation, but encoded account of how post-catastrophe populations were organized and educated. The flood wasn't divine punishment, but memory of actual catastrophe. And the Sumerian king list wasn't mythology transitioning to history, but two different types of historical record. Pre-catastrophe memory using different recording systems versus post-catastrophe documentation using chronological systems we recognize. This interpretation treats ancient people as sophisticated observers and preservers of their own past, not as primitive mythmakers inventing stories to explain what they couldn't understand. It takes seriously the possibility that they knew things we don't know, because their access to the past was different than ours. Not better, not worse, but different. They had oral traditions, textual transmissions, and cultural memories going back further than our archaeological evidence extends. That doesn't make them infallible, but it doesn't make them irrelevant either. The pattern mainstream scholarship sees, mythology encoding social structures and theological worldviews, is real and important. But there might be deeper pattern underneath, historical memory encoded in mythological language, because that's how pre-literate and early literate civilizations preserved knowledge across catastrophic discontinuity. The Sumerians believed they were recording history. We've decided they were creating mythology. But what if we're both right? What if mythology and history aren't opposites, but methods, and ancient texts can be simultaneously mythological in language and historical in content? That would require reading more carefully, distinguishing between divine actors, potentially metaphoric, and described events, potentially historic, between theological claims, early Pacific, and preserved information, potentially unival. This alternative reading doesn't replace mainstream scholarship. It supplements it. The texts are still ideological. They explain present reality. They're still theologically sophisticated. They address fundamental questions about existence. They're still culturally valuable. They reveal ancient worldviews. But they might also be something else. Preserved memory of humanity's deeper past, encoded in the only language available, transmitted by people who understood they were maintaining knowledge from before their own time. The Ajiji rebellion, in this reading, happened. Not gods literally burning tools and surrounding Enlil's temple, but workers, human workers in pre-catastrophe civilization, refusing unbearable labor and forcing systemic change. The text preserves that memory, that pattern, that social dynamic using divine actors, because that's how authority was conceptualized and discussed. But underneath the divine language, there's human history, specific enough to preserve procedural details, geographic enough to name real places, consistent enough across multiple texts to suggest common source, and important enough that Mesopotamian civilization maintained these texts for thousands of years, considering them foundational to understanding who they were and where they came from. This is the pattern potentially overlooked. Not that the texts are pure mythology, but that they're mixed documents, encoding both theological worldviews and historical memories, and that we might learn more by treating both aspects seriously rather than dismissing historical possibility once we identify mythological elements. The Sumerians recorded what they believed mattered. Maybe we should trust that belief, even as we carefully evaluate the forms through which they recorded it. What rebellion meant then and now. If the Ajiji rebellion happened, whether as literal divine revolt or as historical event encoded in mythological language, What did it mean to the people who preserved the story? And what might it mean to us? For the Mesopotamians themselves, the rebellion explained fundamental realities. You work because workers were always necessary. The Ajiji worked before you. You work after them. Work is cosmic constant, not cultural accident. Your labor isn't meaningless drudgery. It maintains civilization itself, the canals and fields and infrastructure that separate ordered human existence from chaos. The gods themselves couldn't escape this necessity. They tried, and all it accomplished was transferring the burden to you, but the burden itself couldn't be eliminated. That's a sobering cosmology, but also a realistic one. Mesopotamian life required enormous labor. Without irrigation, southern Mesopotamia was desert or marsh, unsuitable for agriculture. With irrigation, it was extraordinarily productive, capable of supporting dense urban populations. But irrigation systems demanded constant maintenance. Canals silted, embankments eroded, salt accumulated in fields, requiring drainage and management. A farmer didn't just plant and harvest, he maintained infrastructure, participated in communal canal cleaning, paid taxes and labor to maintain larger water systems. Labor was universal, inescapable, and collective. The Atrahasis epic made sense of this by making it cosmic. You don't work because your king or priest demands it, though they do demand it. You work because reality itself requires it. Before humans, gods did this work. They found it unbearable. You find it unbearable too. That's not failure or weakness, that's the nature of labor. Even divine beings couldn't sustain it indefinitely, without rest, relief, or revolt. Your suffering isn't unique, it's universal. The cosmos is built on toil, divine and human. But the text also validated resistance. The Ajiji succeeded. Their refusal worked. They burned tools, surrounded authority, refused to continue, and forced the system to find different solution. They didn't suffer eternal punishment. They achieved freedom from unbearable labor. The text doesn't condemn them. It describes them matter-of-factly, acknowledges their suffering was real, and records that their collective action forced systemic change. For Mesopotamian laborers, hearing this story and the Atrahasis epic would have been known broadly through oral tradition, not just among literate elites, that validation mattered. Your suffering is real. Collective refusal is possible. Even systems that seem eternal can be forced to change. The Ajiji proved it. You carry their intelligence in your blood. You inherited their work, but you also inherited their capacity for refusal. That's double message. Work is necessary and eternal. But unbearable work can be refused, and refusal can force reorganization. Both truths coexist. Authority depends on labor. Labor can be withdrawn. That mutual dependence creates space for negotiation, even in rigidly hierarchical societies. Not easy negotiation, not safe negotiation, but possible negotiation. For Mesopotamian elites, the text reinforced authority while acknowledging its limits. The Anunnaki maintained cosmic order. Their decisions shaped reality. Rebellion against them was dangerous, costly, and usually failed. See Inanna, see Gilgamesh, see Anzu. But the Ajiji succeeded because their labor was necessary and their collective action was strong enough that suppression would have been self-defeating. Elite audiences hearing this would understand, maintain hierarchy, defend authority, but recognize that labor forces have real power if they choose to exercise it collectively. Crushing a workforce eliminates production. Better to negotiate, compromise, find sustainable arrangements. The post-flood arrangement in Atrahasis embodies this elite realism. Humans will multiply but not infinitely. Natural limits prevent exponential growth. Humans will complain but not revolt successfully. They lack the divine power the Ajiji had. Humans will provide labor and worship. That's their function. But they won't be pushed to absolute breaking point. The system learned from the Ajiji revolt that breaking points are real, and pushing workers beyond them creates crises. The compromise that ended the epic represented stable arrangement. Humans work, gods protect. Neither side pushes the relationship to catastrophic extremes. For temple and palace administrators, the text provided management philosophy. Don't overburden populations. Don't ignore signs of distress. Don't assume authority is unlimited. Maintain order, yes, but recognize that order depends on consent or at least acquiescence of the governed. When populations become too noisy, that's signal that requires response before crisis escalates. Better to adjust than to face rebellion or collapse. This wasn't liberal democracy or human rights. This was sophisticated authoritarianism that recognized practical limits on power. The Mesopotamian political system was hierarchical, unequal, and exploitative by modern standards. But it wasn't stupid. It understood that populations under too much pressure either escape, rebel, or collapse, and all three outcomes damage elite interests. The mythology encoded that understanding, teaching it to generation after generation through narratives that made the lesson cosmic and eternal. Now consider what this means today. We live in different societies with different power structures, but fundamental dynamics remain. Labor is still necessary. Populations still grow and create complexity. Authorities still try to control noise, literal and figurative. Systems still face crises when populations are pushed beyond sustainable limits, and collective refusal still works when populations find sufficient solidarity and leverage. The Ajiji Rebellion is perhaps history's first recorded strike. Whether divine or human, mythological or encoded historical, it preserves pattern we've seen throughout civilization. Workers decide conditions are unbearable. Workers organize collectively. Workers refuse to continue. Authorities must choose between suppression and negotiation. Sometimes suppression works. See countless broken strikes throughout history. Sometimes negotiation occurs. See countless labor compromises that produced reforms. The text acknowledges both possibilities without guaranteeing either outcome. What's striking is that this pattern appears in humanity's earliest literature. We've been negotiating labor and authority since the beginning of written history, possibly earlier. The questions haven't changed. How much labor is too much? Who decides? What happens when workers refuse? How do systems adapt or resist? The Atrahasis epic engaged these questions 4,000 years ago using divine actors and mythological framework. We engage them today using secular language and economic theory. But the underlying dynamic is constant. The text also highlights something often forgotten in modern discussions: mutual dependence between authority and population. Gods needed humans. That's why genocide via flood backfired and forced compromise. Humans needed gods, protection, order, management of large-scale infrastructure that individuals couldn't maintain alone. Neither side could function without the other. That dependence creates power dynamics different from simple domination. It's more complex, more negotiable, more prone to breakdown when either side pushes too hard. Modern societies obscure this mutual dependence through intermediate structures, markets, bureaucracies, corporations, technologies that mediate between labor and benefit. But fundamental truth remains. Elites need populations to generate wealth, maintain systems, fight wars, produce everything that makes elite status possible. Populations need coordination, infrastructure, knowledge, and organizational capacity that usually requires hierarchical structures. The relationship is exploitative and unequal, yes, but it's also necessary on both sides. Neither can fully dominate without destroying what the other provides. The Igigi recognized this. Their rebellion worked because the Anunnaki needed them. If Igigi labor wasn't necessary, the rebellion would have been suppressed and rebels punished. But the work had to be done, and only the Igigi were doing it. That necessity gave them leverage. They used it. The system adapted. Human history since then repeats this pattern endlessly. Slavery systems collapse when free labor becomes more economically efficient or when slave resistance becomes too costly. Feudal systems break down when peasants gain mobility or organize collectively. Industrial systems face labor movements when working conditions become unbearable. Each time, authorities either adapt or face revolution. Sometimes they adapt through reforms, better conditions, shorter hours, higher wages, legal protections. Sometimes they resist until revolution destroys them and new systems emerge. But they can't simply maintain status quo when underlying populations refuse to continue. That's the lesson the Atrahasis epic teaches. It also teaches that replacement workers don't solve the problem, they inherit it. Humans replaced the Igigi, but faced the same fundamental issue. Work is hard, populations multiply, noise disturbs order, systems strain under growth. Creating new laboring class didn't eliminate labor tensions. It shifted them. Eventually, humans became as noisy as the Igigi were, and the system faced similar crises requiring similar compromises. Replacing one workforce with another, one population with another, doesn't resolve underlying contradictions. It postpones them until the new population reaches critical mass and generates its own resistance. This is visible throughout colonial and post-colonial history. Colonizers eliminate or subjugate indigenous populations and import enslaved or indentured labor. The new labor forces eventually organize, resist, demand rights, force changes. Systems adapt or collapse. The cycle continues. Simply replacing workers doesn't create sustainable stability. It creates temporary delay before similar dynamics emerge again. The Atrahasis epic understood this. The post-flood compromise wasn't permanent solution, but sustainable arrangement, natural limits on population growth, divine protection in exchange for labor and worship, mutual recognition that neither side could eliminate the other without self-harm. It's treaty, not victory, negotiation, not resolution. And that might be the text's deepest realism. Fundamental tensions don't resolve. They're managed, negotiated, adapted to. Expecting permanent solutions is naive. Expecting stable arrangements through mutual recognition of dependence is realistic. For us, reading this text thousands of years later in vastly different societies, the core insights remain relevant. Labor is necessary and often unpleasant. Authorities depend on populations even as they exploit them. Populations have power through collective refusal, but using that power is costly, and success isn't guaranteed. Systems adapt to pressure if adaptation costs less than suppression, and no arrangement is permanent. All systems face ongoing negotiation between competing interests. The text also reminds us that these aren't new dynamics. We didn't invent labor tension in the Industrial Revolution or discover it through modern political philosophy. This is ancient, possibly prehistoric human experience. People have always worked. Some people have always organized and controlled other people's work. Workers have always resented excessive burdens. Authorities have always tried to maximize extraction while maintaining system functionality. And the negotiation between these forces has always shaped how civilizations develop, thrive, strain, collapse, and rebuild. Knowing this history doesn't solve current problems, but it provides perspective. The labor struggles we face today aren't unprecedented. They're continuation of pattern as old as civilization. The Ajiji burned their tools 4,000 years ago, whether literally or metaphorically. Workers still strike today. The tactics evolve. The technologies change. The specific demands vary, but the fundamental pattern, collective refusal forcing negotiation, remains constant because it emerges from basic realities of organized human societies. The Atrahasis epic teaches that rebellion is possible, sometimes successful, always costly, and never final. The Ajiji won their freedom, but were largely erased from subsequent texts. Humans replaced them and faced similar struggles. Systems adapted but didn't achieve perfect stability. Authority and labor continued their tense negotiation through catastrophes, compromises, and countless individual and collective dramas. That negotiation continues today. It will continue tomorrow. It's not a problem to be solved, but dynamic to be navigated, generation after generation. We carry Wi'ila's blood. We inherit the Ajiji's work. We face the same tensions they faced. We have the same intelligence they had, consciousness of suffering, capacity for organization, ability to refuse, but we also have the same limitations: mortality, vulnerability, dependence on systems larger than ourselves. We're powerful and powerless simultaneously, capable of resistance and subject to forces beyond our control. That contradiction defined the Igigi. It defines us. And the Mesopotamians recording this story understood that contradiction was fundamental to human existence in civilized societies. So what did rebellion mean then? It meant workers could refuse, systems could adapt, and neither outcome was guaranteed. It meant labor was necessary but unbearable, cosmic but negotiable. It meant authority was real but limited, powerful but dependent. It meant tension between order and freedom was permanent feature of civilization, not temporary problem awaiting solution. And what does it mean now? Exactly the same things. We're still living the pattern the Atrahasis epic describes, still negotiating labor and authority, still discovering our power and our limits, still learning that collective action can force change but never guarantees specific outcomes, still recognizing that systems need us as much as we need systems, even when power is grossly unequal, still carrying ancient intelligence that enables both service and refusal, both acceptance and resistance. The Igigi rebelled. We exist because of that rebellion. We inherited their work and their consciousness. What we do with that inheritance, whether we work quietly, resist collectively, negotiate individually, or organize transformation, that's choice each generation makes. The Atrahasis epic doesn't prescribe choice. It simply preserves the knowledge that choice exists, has always existed, and will always matter. Authority isn't absolute. Labor isn't powerless. Systems change when forced, and the negotiation continues. Ancient as civilization itself, modern as today's struggles, eternal as the human condition in organized societies. That's what rebellion meant then. That's what it means now. And the Sumerians, writing this down 4,000 years ago, made sure we'd remember. The question remains unresolved. The night is quiet. Outside, wherever you are, the world continues its work. Infrastructure maintained, systems running, labor performed. Not so different from ancient Mesopotamia, really. Different tools, different scales, different organizational methods, but fundamentally similar dynamic. Work is necessary, someone must do it, systems emerge to organize that work, and tensions inevitably develop between those who labor and those who direct labor. We've explored the possibility that Sumerian cuneiform tablets preserve memory of rebellion. Not the only rebellion as pattern, recurring across divine and human history, mythological and potentially historical. The Igigi laid down their tools. Inanna challenged underworld authority. Gilgamesh sought forbidden immortality. Anzu stole cosmic power. Humanity multiplied beyond designed limits. Each story different, each outcome varied, but pattern consistent. Subordinates can refuse subordination, systems must adapt or suppress, and neither adaptation nor suppression provides permanent resolution. Whether these are myths about divine beings or encoded memories of human events, the pattern matters. It appears in literature from the very beginning of writing. The Sumerians, establishing civilization's foundational texts, included rebellion stories, not as warnings against evil, but as explorations of possibility and consequence. These weren't people who couldn't conceive of challenging authority. They conceived it clearly, described it specifically, and preserved those descriptions for thousands of years. We can't prove the Igigi rebellion happened historically. We can't demonstrate that Atrahasis epic encodes pre-catastrophe social dynamics rather than merely explaining present realities through mythological backstory. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. Mainstream scholarly interpretation, these are myths serving cultural and theological functions, remains defensible and well supported. But alternative reading is also possible. What if these texts preserve more history than we acknowledge? What if mythological language was framework for encoding knowledge about deeper past? What if rapid Sumerian civilizational emergence represents recovery rather than pure invention, reconstitution of knowledge from pre-catastrophe civilization whose physical evidence hasn't survived or hasn't been recognized? These questions remain open. We don't know. The texts exist. They describe specific events, name specific places, provide procedural details, maintain consistency across sources, and frame themselves as preservation rather than invention. But they use divine actors, impossible chronologies, supernatural elements that signal mythology to modern readers. Both readings, mythological and historical, find support in textual evidence. Neither can be definitively proven. Perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. History and mythology aren't necessarily opposites. They're methods of preserving and transmitting knowledge, each with different strengths and limitations. Mythology uses archetypal figures and supernatural causation to encode patterns, meanings, and social dynamics that remain true across generations. History uses chronological narrative and natural causation to record specific events in specific times. But both can coexist in single text, woven together so thoroughly that later readers struggle to separate them. The Mesopotamians themselves might not have made this distinction. Their worldview integrated what we separate: religious, political, social, historical, mythological. All aspects of reality flowed together. Divine beings were real entities shaping human affairs. Past events had cosmic significance. Labor organization reflected divine precedent. The texts described their world as they understood it, using categories and concepts available to them. We inherit those texts, but not their worldview. We read with different assumptions, different categories, different methods. We can study the texts as literature, theology, sociology, or history. Each approach reveals something genuine. None captures everything the texts might preserve. So the question remains unresolved. Did the Ajiji rebellion happen? As literal divine revolt, almost certainly not. Modern understanding of reality doesn't include gods digging canals and burning tools. As encoded human event from pre-literate civilization, maybe. As mythological pattern capturing eternal dynamics between labor and authority, definitely. As foundational narrative shaping how Mesopotamians understood work, hierarchy, and social organization, absolutely. All these readings coexist. The texts support multiple interpretations simultaneously. That's not failure of clarity, that's richness of meaning. Great literature operates on multiple levels. The Atrahasis epic functions as theology, explaining divine human relationships, as sociology, analyzing labor and authority, as history, potentially preserving deep memories, as literature, creating compelling narrative, as cultural transmission, teaching values and worldviews. It does all these things at once, and we diminish it by insisting it must be only one. What we can say with confidence, the Sumerians took labor seriously enough to make it cosmic. They understood authority's dependence on populations. They recognized that work has limits and workers can resist. They knew systems must adapt when populations reach breaking points. They believed their civilization inherited or restored something older rather than inventing everything fresh. And they considered these ideas important enough to preserve in their most central literature, maintaining and transmitting them across centuries of social upheaval. That preservation matters. The Atrahasis epic could have been lost. Thousands of cuneiform tablets were. But this text survived in multiple copies from multiple periods. It was taught in scribal schools. It was referenced by other literature. It was translated from Sumerian to Akkadian as linguistic demographics shifted. It was maintained by priests, copied by students, valued by kings. Many someones across many generations decided this story mattered, that it contained knowledge worth preserving, that future generations needed to know about the Ajiji rebellion, human creation, the flood, and the compromises that followed. They were right. We're reading it now. 4,000 years later, in technologies they couldn't imagine, we're exploring what their texts might mean. The transmission worked. The knowledge survived. We might interpret differently than they intended. We might extract different meanings. But the core pattern they preserved, rebellion is possible, systems adapt or break, labor and authority exist in permanent tension, that pattern still resonates because it still describes our reality. The tools that burned that night in the Atrahasis epic, whether divine or human, literal or metaphorical, represented a moment when work stopped and questions started. Questions about who decides how much work is acceptable, questions about what happens when workers refuse, questions about whether systems claiming eternal necessity might actually be contingent arrangements subject to negotiation. Those questions echo through history. The Ajiji asked them first, according to the text. We're still asking them today. You exist in that lineage. You carry We-Ila's consciousness. You perform labor the Ajiji refused. You live in civilization built on work, maintained by work, dependent on work. And you have intelligence, capacity to recognize when work is excessive, solidarity to organize collective response, courage to refuse when refusal becomes necessary. You also have mortality, vulnerability, dependence on systems larger than yourself. You're powerful and powerless, free and constrained, capable of resistance and subject to forces beyond control. That was true for the Ajiji, true for the Sumerians, true now. And according to these texts, it's been true since the beginning, whenever and whatever that beginning was. The pattern is old. The negotiation is eternal. The question of how we navigate between order and freedom, authority and autonomy, necessary work and unbearable exploitation, that question has no final answer. It's asked and answered provisionally, generation after generation, through actions more than words. The Atrahasis epic doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you that others have faced similar situations before. They made choices. Some choices worked, some didn't. Systems adapted. People survived. Civilization continued, but changed. That's precedent, not prescription. Knowledge that it's possible, not guarantee of success. Understanding that you're not the first and won't be the last to stand where you're standing. Wondering whether acceptance or resistance makes more sense. The tablets exist. You can visit them in museums if you wish. The British Museum, the Penn Museum, the Louvre, the Yale Babylonian Collection. You can see the cuneiform yourself, wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay millennia ago, preserved by accident and intention through fire, burial, discovery, and scholarly care. Someone made those marks. Someone pressed a stylus into wet clay and recorded a story about the moment when divine workers said enough. Whether divine or human, mythological or historical, that story persists. The work continues, the tension continues, the negotiation continues, and you're part of it, carrying ancient intelligence in mortal form, maintaining civilization that predates you and will survive you, working within systems you didn't choose but might help change, living the pattern the Atrahasis epic describes. Labor is necessary. Authority is real. Both have limits. Populations can resist. Systems can adapt. Catastrophe can reset everything. And after catastrophe, survivors rebuild, hopefully wiser, certainly different, carrying forward what knowledge they can preserve through whatever language and concepts they possess. The Ajiji burned their tools. We remember that rebellion. The memory persists. The question remains open. And the world continues, maintained by work, shaped by negotiation, transformed through resistance, stable until it isn't, eternal until it ends. Sleep well. Dream of ancient fires, lighting the night around a temple, of tools burning, of workers refusing, of systems adapting. Dream of floods and rebuilding, of clay mixed with divine blood, of intelligence transmitted across generations. Dream of the pattern that connects us to the Sumerians, them to whoever came before, all of us to fundamental questions about labor, authority, and the possibility of refusal. The tablets are silent now. The gods, if they existed, are gone. But the pattern they described, or the pattern preserved in their names, continues. You live it. We all do. And somewhere in museum archives and ancient ruins, pressed into clay that has outlasted empires, the record remains. The Ajigi rebelled. Humanity inherited their work. The system adapted. The story survived. And 4,000 years later, someone is reading about it, wondering what it means, carrying the same questions forward into uncertain futures, maintaining the transmission just by engaging with it, proving that some rebellions succeed in ways their instigators never intended, not through overthrowing systems, but through forcing systems to preserve the memory that systems can be overthrown. That's the final revelation. The true rebellion might not be the Ajiji's refusal to work. It might be that their refusal was recorded, preserved, transmitted, and maintained by the very civilization that replaced them. The system they challenged encoded their challenge in its foundational texts. Authority preserved rebellion's memory, and we inherit that complex legacy, both the work and the knowledge that the work can be refused. The Sumerian scribes wrote this down. Mesopotamian civilization maintained it. You've encountered it now. The transmission continues. The question remains unresolved. The pattern persists. And somewhere, in the silence between past and future, the echo of burning tools still resonates, reminding us that subordination isn't absolute, that systems adapt when forced, and that the relationship between those who work and those who direct work has been negotiated, challenged, and occasionally transformed since the beginning of recorded history. That negotiation continues. It will continue tomorrow. The Ajigi's rebellion, real or mythological, divine or human, taught us that. And the Sumerians, by preserving that teaching, ensured we'd never forget it. The question remains unresolved, but the question itself, persistent, recurring, eternal, might be more important than any final answer. Because the question means possibility. And possibility, even without guarantee, changes everything. Rest now. The work resumes tomorrow. It always does. But so does the possibility of refusal. Both truths coexist, ancient as civilization, modern as this moment, preserved in clay tablets that have outlasted empires to remind us. The Ajigi rebelled, and we remember.